The air is still. You are not sure where you are yet, not precisely, but the feeling is one of great age, of something so ancient it has folded back on itself and become quiet. There is a forest. You sense it more than see it. The trees are tall and close together, and the light that finds its way down through the canopy is thin and pale, the color of old linen. Somewhere nearby, water is moving, not rushing, just moving, the way water does when it has all the time in the world. Something lands on the branch above your head. You do not hear it land. It is that small. There is a pause, a held breath in the undergrowth, and then a tiny rustle, no louder than a leaf adjusting its angle to the light. You look up, but the canopy is deep and layered, and whatever is up there is already still again, already invisible against the bark, already part of the texture of this ancient world. This is what you came to find. Not the giants, not the creatures whose footsteps would have shaken the ground beneath your feet and sent ripples across every standing pool of water within a mile. You came to find the other ones, the ones that crept along branches no thicker than your wrist, the ones that slept in hollows in the bark and woke before dawn to hunt insects in the half-dark, the ones that science almost missed entirely, the ones that changed everything. The branch moves again, just slightly, and somewhere in the deep shade of a forest that has been gone for 125 million years, something very small is watching you back. Let the world go quiet around you. We are going back a long way tonight, and the creatures we are looking for are some of the most remarkable that ever lived. Close your eyes, if they are not already closed. Let your breathing slow to match the pace of this telling, which is unhurried, which has nowhere in particular to be, which is content to move the way deep water moves, without visible current, without urgency, carrying everything it carries gently and without effort. Tonight, we are going to talk about something that most people never think about when they think about dinosaurs. When the word dinosaur enters the mind, it tends to summon giants. It summons the long, slow, swinging neck of Brachiosaurus, impossibly tall against a Jurassic sky. It summons the Tyrannosaur, that monument to appetite and muscle, its breath fogging the prehistoric air. It summons the Triceratops with its great frill catching the morning light, the Stegosaurus with its plated spine, the Brontosaurus setting its foot down on the ancient earth with a sound like distant thunder. These are the creatures that fill the museums, that fill the imaginations of children who will never quite recover from their first encounter with something so enormous it barely seems real. But there was another world running alongside that world of giants, a world of creatures so small they could have sat in the palm of your hand, a world of feathered hunters no bigger than crows, of tree climbers the weight of a sparrow, of gliding four-winged hunters that moved through the forest canopy like living kites, of creatures whose bones were so light and so fine that finding them at all, 100 million years later, represents something close to a miracle of preservation and human patience. This is the story of the smallest dinosaurs that ever lived. It is a story of discovery and revision, of moments when science looked at a tiny fragment of ancient bone and completely failed to understand what it was seeing, and of moments when everything suddenly became clear. It is a story that stretches from the deep past to the present day, because the smallest dinosaurs that ever lived are not all extinct. Some of them are alive right now, visiting flowers, beating their wings so fast you can barely see them, their hearts hammering at a rate that would destroy any larger creature. They are the descendants of a lineage that has been shrinking for 50 million years, and they are spectacular. But we begin, as all great stories begin, in the dark, in the ancient dark of a world that no human eye has ever seen, where something very small moves through the undergrowth of a forest that is now stone, and the only record it left behind was so thin, so delicate, so nearly lost that it took the better part of 2 centuries for anyone to find it at all. Settle in. Let the weight of the day release from your shoulders. We have a long way to travel tonight, and the road is a quiet one. If you enjoy listening to sleepy prehistoric dinosaur stories like this, subscribe. New stories arrive weekly, and they will be here waiting for you whenever you need them. There is a place in what is now northeastern China, in a province called Liaoning, where the hills are made of something that looks, at first glance, like ordinary grey rock. Farmers have worked this land for generations. They have built homes from the stone and laid the rock in walls, and used it to line the edges of their fields. For a very long time, nobody thought much about it. Rock is rock. The world is full of rock. And then someone looked more carefully, and the rock turned out not to be rock at all, or not only rock, but a record, a library, written in stone, of a world so ancient and so different from the world we inhabit that the mind struggles to hold it. The sediments of Liaoning province were laid down during the early Cretaceous period, roughly 120 to 130 million years ago. At that time, the landscape was defined by a series of shallow lakes and rivers, surrounded by dense forests and periodically disrupted by volcanic eruptions that sent ash and gases across the region. Creatures that died near the lake shores or in the water would sometimes sink into the fine sediment at the lake bottom, where low oxygen conditions slowed decomposition and allowed extraordinary preservation. Feathers, scales, the soft impressions of skin, even the outlines of organs, in some exceptional cases. All of it locked into the stone like insects into amber, waiting for 100 million years to be found. What the Liaoning deposits have given us is unlike anything discovered anywhere else on Earth. Hundreds of species, thousands of specimens, a window into an ecosystem so complete and so detailed that paleontologists from around the world have spent their careers working through it and are still, after decades, finding new things. And the creatures that have come out of that grey stone have forced a complete reconsideration of what we thought we knew about the age of dinosaurs. Picture the world of early Cretaceous Liaoning. You are standing at the edge of a broad, shallow lake. The water is dark, stained by the organic matter washing in from the surrounding forests. The air is warm and humid. It carries the smell of mud and wet vegetation and something faintly sulphurous from the volcanic activity that is never quite absent from this landscape. The sky above you is a pale, hazy blue, and the sun, when it appears between the clouds that seem to be a constant feature of this climate, falls on a forest that looks familiar enough to register as forest, but alien enough to be unsettling. The trees are conifers, mostly, tall, dark-needled, their roots reaching into the wet soil near the lake shore, their crowns forming an uneven canopy that shifts and murmurs in the wind. Mixed in among them are ginkgos, which have been on Earth since the Permian, and will still be on Earth when you are standing here reading this account. There are ferns in the undergrowth, dense and low to the ground, catching the thin light that makes it through the canopy. There are cycads with their stiff, palm-like fronds. The first flowering plants are just beginning to appear in this world, shy and experimental, tucked into the forest margins, not yet the dominant presence they will one day become. This is a world still largely green and ancient, a world of spores and cones and seeds designed for a climate without seasons as we understand them. In this world, the giants are present. You would know it from the sounds. There are long-necked sauropods in the more open lowlands to the south, and their footsteps, even at this distance, produce a faint trembling in the ground beneath your feet. There are ornithischian dinosaurs, plant-eaters of various sizes, moving through the forest margins. There are large theropod predators whose territories encompass many square miles, and you would not want to be between one of them and its prey. The megafauna of this world is real and present and enormous, and it commands attention in the way that enormous things always do. But that is not where the most interesting story is happening. Not today. Today, the most interesting story is happening above your head, in the canopy, where the light is filtered and green, and the air is full of the sounds of insects, and the occasional high, thin call of something you cannot quite identify. Up there, in the branches of a conifer whose trunk is thicker than a house, something is moving. Something small, something that stops when you look up toward it, that becomes still and invisible against the bark, with an ease that suggests it has been practicing this stillness for its entire life. The small ones are everywhere in this ecosystem, if you know how to look. They are in the undergrowth, turning over leaves to find the insects sheltering beneath. They are in the root systems of the large trees, using the hollow spaces created by the decay of old wood as shelter and hunting ground. They are at the lakeshore, picking through the rack of decayed vegetation that collects at the water's edge, finding the tiny crustaceans and worms that live in the shallows. And they are in the canopy, the most extraordinary of all their habitats, moving through a three-dimensional world of branch and leaf and vertical space with a comfort that the giants below could never share. Here is the first thing you should know. and it is something that surprises most people when they encounter it. The Liaoning fossil beds have produced more diverse specimens of small, feathered dinosaurs than any other location on Earth. Not just a few, hundreds of species across dozens of genera, many of them entirely unknown before the Liaoning deposits began to be seriously studied in the 1990s. The sheer quantity and diversity of tiny feathered theropods from this single region has rewritten our understanding of what the dinosaur family tree looks like and where birds came from, and what the Mesozoic world actually contained beneath the level of the giants. This is unknown fact number 1 in our story, and it is a large one. For most of the 20th century, we had almost no idea how many tiny dinosaurs there were, because we had almost no idea where to find them. Think about the quality of silence in a forest. Not the silence of an empty room, which is a specific kind of nothing, but the silence of a living forest, which is not silent at all but is composed of so many small sounds layered on top of each other that they cancel out into a kind of texture. The wind in needles is a shushing sound. Water dripping from a leaf is a tap, repeated and varied. Insects create a continuous undertone that rises and falls with the temperature and the time of day. And through all of this, occasionally, comes something that is not wind and not water and not insect. A skitter of claws on bark, a rustle that moves through the canopy in a direction that suggests intention, a small bright eye catching the light for a fraction of a second before the creature turns and is gone. You are looking at the world that produced the smallest dinosaurs. Not the Jurassic, not yet, though the story of miniaturization begins there. But here, in the early Cretaceous, in the rich and complicated ecology of a landscape that no longer exists except in stone, the process is well advanced. The creatures moving through these trees have been getting smaller for tens of millions of years. Their ancestors were larger. Their descendants will be larger in a different way, transformed by the pressures of a world that has not yet happened, flying through an atmosphere that does not yet know what a bird is. The Liaoning ecosystem was, by any measure, among the most ecologically rich of the entire Mesozoic era. The volcanic activity that periodically disrupted it was also, paradoxically, what preserved it so well. Ash layers sealed the lake sediments. Rapid burial prevented scavenging. The chemistry of the lake floor discouraged the bacteria that would otherwise have disassembled every soft structure before it could become stone. The result was a fossil record of extraordinary completeness, and when scientists began to excavate it seriously in the late 20th century, what they found was so far beyond expectations that the paleontological community had to pause and reconsider several of its most fundamental assumptions. Here is something to hold in your mind as you rest tonight. Every giant begins in smallness. Every great lineage has a moment when it was marginal, when it occupied the periphery of ecosystems that were dominated by other things, when it was overlooked and underestimated and barely visible against the background of the world it inhabited. The dinosaurs themselves began that way, 230 million years ago, small and overshadowed by larger reptiles that seemed far more likely to dominate the future. And then something changed, and the world reorganized itself around the dinosaurs, and the dinosaurs were no longer marginal. But within the lineage of the dinosaurs, the same story played out again. A group of small, feathered theropods that seemed marginal even within the age of dinosaurs turned out to be carrying something in their bones and feathers and behaviors that would outlast everything else. And they are still here. The forest of Liaoning holds everything we will need tonight. Its sediments are our archive. Its fossils are our witnesses. And among those witnesses are creatures whose smallness was not a disadvantage but a strategy, not a weakness but an innovation, not a marginal footnote in the story of life, but the very hinge on which the future of all vertebrate life on land would eventually turn. We will meet them. We will understand them as well as the fragmentary and wonderful evidence allows. And along the way, we will encounter some of the most surprising and counterintuitive discoveries that modern paleontology has made about what the age of dinosaurs actually contained. But for now, just breathe. Let the sounds of the ancient forest settle into the background of your awareness. The tap of water from a leaf. The slow creak of a conifer branch under a weight you cannot see. The distant sound of wings, not large wings, not the leathery beat of a pterosaur catching a thermal above the lake, but small wings, quick wings, the kind of wings that belong to something that lives in the spaces between the branches rather than above the canopy. That sound is something new in the world, something that has been evolving toward its current form for millions of years and still has millions of years to go before it arrives at the shape we would recognize. But even now, in the dim, filtered light of an early Cretaceous morning, it is unmistakably itself, unmistakably alive, unmistakably present in a world that will one day leave it behind in stone, so that we, 100 million years from now, can find it again and try to understand what it was. There is a physics to being small that most people have never thought about, and it is worth thinking about tonight, here in the quiet, because it explains so much about why the smallest dinosaurs were the way they were, and why the path from large-bodied theropod to sparrow-sized bird took the particular shape it did, and why the creatures at the small end of the dinosaur spectrum were so extraordinarily different from the ones at the large end. Being small is not simply being large, but reduced. It is a fundamentally different way of existing in the world, with different rules, different dangers, different advantages, and different possibilities. Consider heat. A large animal, a sauropod say, or even a large theropod, carries so much mass that it holds heat the way a boulder holds the warmth of a summer afternoon, slowly releasing it through the long night, cooling only gradually, never reaching the extremes that smaller bodies reach. An animal the size of a house, cat, or a crow, or a sparrow has no such thermal inertia. Its surface area is enormous relative to its volume, which means it radiates heat into the surrounding air at a rate that would kill a larger animal if they were scaled down to the same size. The smaller you are, the faster you lose heat. This is not a theoretical observation. It is a lived reality for every small, warm-blooded creature on Earth today, and it was equally real for the small theropods of the Mesozoic. The consequence is metabolism. To stay alive, to maintain a body temperature that permits all the biochemical processes of existence to continue functioning, a small, warm-blooded animal must eat constantly, not occasionally, not when prey becomes available, but continuously, relentlessly, with a focus that borders on obsession. A shrew will die in a matter of hours if it cannot find food. A hummingbird enters a state of controlled hypothermia each night, dropping its body temperature dramatically to conserve the energy it cannot otherwise afford to spend on heating itself through the dark hours. Small, warm-blooded animals are, in a very real sense, slaves to their own caloric needs in a way that large animals are not. They have very little margin for error, and here is the counterintuitive beauty of this arrangement. That same metabolic intensity that makes small, warm-blooded animals dependent on constant feeding also makes them extraordinarily capable. Their muscles work faster, their nerves fire more rapidly. Their reaction times are so compressed compared to larger animals that the world, as they experience it, appears to move in something like slow motion. A housefly that seems to evade your hand so easily is not particularly quick by its own standards. From inside its much faster nervous system, your hand is moving at the speed of a glacier. The small theropods of the Mesozoic would have experienced their world in something of the same way, fast and immediate and saturated with sensory information that larger animals processed more slowly. The bones of small theropods reflect all of this. They are hollow, not in the way that a hollow tube is simply empty, but in the way that a cathedral is hollow, with internal structure, with cross-bracing, with a design that removes every gram of unnecessary weight while maintaining the structural integrity needed for the stresses of fast movement. Hollow bones are not fragile. They are light. And lightness, in a small animal that lives by speed and agility, is the most important property a bone can have. Every gram of unnecessary mass is a gram that must be moved, accelerated, and decelerated by muscles that are already working at their physiological limit. The bones of small feathered theropods are marvels of evolved engineering, refined over tens of millions of years into structures that achieve the maximum possible strength for the minimum possible weight. This hollow bone structure, it should be noted, is not exclusive to birds among dinosaurs. It was already present in the small theropods of the Jurassic and Cretaceous, a property that they carried into the avian lineage rather than evolving freshly. When paleontologists find a fragment of hollow, thin-walled bone in the sediment, they know they are dealing with a member of the theropod lineage, because the structural commitment to lightness is already there, already built into the architecture of these animals, tens of millions of years before any of them became what we would recognize as a bird. This is one of the most important and least appreciated facts about the evolution of birds. So many of their defining features were not invented by birds. They were inherited from small, non-avian dinosaurs that preceded them by millions of years. Consider the ecological advantages of small size in a Mesozoic forest. A large animal, however dominant it might be in open country, is at a profound disadvantage in dense vegetation. It cannot follow its prey into tight spaces. It cannot exploit the resources that exist only in the highest canopy, where branch diameter limits the weight of any visitor. It cannot hide. It cannot wait out danger in a crack in the bark or a hollow in a root. A large predator is, in many respects, a victim of its own impressiveness, constrained to the environments where its size is an advantage and denied access to everything else. A small theropod suffered none of these limitations. The forests of the Mesozoic were not simple. They were layered, stratified, organized into distinct ecological zones by height and by light level and by moisture and by substrate. The forest floor was one world, dim and rich with decomposing matter, populated by invertebrates of astonishing diversity, by small amphibians, by early mammals moving cautiously through the leaf litter. The shrub layer was another world, brighter and more complex, with flowers beginning to appear in the later Mesozoic and insects diversifying in response. The lower canopy was another world still, with different species, different temperatures, different wind exposure, different opportunities. And the upper canopy, where the crowns of the tallest trees interacted with the full force of the sun, was as different from the forest floor as the open sea is different from a coral reef. Small theropods could move through all of these zones. Their smallness was a passport. Here is another fact that surprises most people who encounter it. Many small theropods were nocturnal. We know this not from direct observation, obviously, but from the anatomy of their skulls. The eye sockets of nocturnal animals are large relative to skull size because large eyes gather more light, and gathering more light is the single most important thing an eye can do in the dark. When paleontologists measure the eye sockets of small theropods and compare them to the predicted eye socket sizes for animals of that body mass, they find that many species had eyes significantly larger than expected. Some were dramatically larger. These were animals built for the dark, for the hour before dawn and the hour after sunset, when the large predators were less active and the forest was full of the rustling of nocturnal insects that represented, for a small, agile hunter, a meal that never stopped serving itself. Picture what it would mean to be a small theropod moving through the pre-dawn forest. The world around you is not dark the way a closed room is dark. The forest at night has its own light, subtle and dispersed. The moonlight filtered through 10 layers of canopy until it arrives at the forest floor as a faint silvery texture rather than illumination proper. But your eyes are built for this. They gather that thin light and amplify it in ways that the brain of a sleeping large predator, resting with its comparative pinhole eyes shut, cannot begin to match. The insect life that you depend on is active in this hour. The competition for that insect life is limited. And the dangers that threaten you are slower than they would be in daylight, less alert, less capable of the quick, decisive action that would end your time in the world. The dark is your territory. The smallness that made you vulnerable in the open day makes you near invisible here, near invincible. The feeding ecology of small theropods was extraordinarily diverse, and this diversity was made possible precisely by their small size. Large theropods were, by metabolic necessity, committed carnivores. They needed large prey. Hunting large prey requires size, power, and the ability to bring down an animal that will resist being eaten. Small theropods faced no such constraint. They could be insectivores, eating the abundant and nutritious insects of the Mesozoic forests, which were themselves far more diverse than any insects alive today. They could be omnivores, combining insects, small vertebrates, eggs, seeds, and plant material in a diet that could be adjusted as seasonal availability shifted. Some appear to have been fish specialists, fishing the shallow lakes and streams. Some may have eaten mollusks, cracking shells with specialized teeth. The metabolic democracy of small size meant that almost any available food source was a viable option. as long as it was abundant enough to meet the constant caloric demand. This dietary flexibility is one of the most important properties that the small theropod lineage carried into the avian future. Modern birds are spectacularly diverse in their diets precisely because they inherited from their small dinosaur ancestors a body plan that is compatible with enormous dietary flexibility. Hummingbirds that drink nectar, penguins that eat fish, eagles that take rabbits, finches that crack seeds with specialized beaks, flamingos that filter microorganisms from alkaline lakes, vultures that consume carrion that would kill other animals. All of this dietary diversity traces back to the same fundamental openness to ecological opportunity that characterized the small theropods of the Mesozoic, who were small enough to eat almost anything and smart enough to find it. There is a particular quality of attention that small animals develop, and it is worth pausing to consider it, because it helps explain why the small theropod lineage ultimately succeeded where so many others failed. Being small in a world that contains large predators requires constant vigilance. Not the vigilance of fear, which is exhausting and ultimately self-defeating, but the vigilance of awareness, the constant low-level monitoring of the environment that picks up the first signal of danger with enough time to respond effectively. Small animals in modern ecosystems demonstrate this quality with remarkable consistency. They are alert in a way that large animals are not. Their heads are constantly moving, checking angles, assessing distances, processing information from multiple sensory channels simultaneously. This alertness is cognitively demanding, and the cognitive demands of being small and alert may have contributed to the relatively large brains that small theropods appear to have possessed. Brain-to-body ratio in small theropods was, by dinosaur standards, extraordinarily high. We know this from endocasts. The impressions of brain shape left inside fossilized skulls, which can tell us the approximate size and organization of the brain, even when the soft tissue itself is long gone. Small feathered theropods had brains that were large relative to their body mass, and the regions of the brain associated with sensory processing and fine motor control were particularly well developed. They were not, in any meaningful sense, the simple reflexive creatures that dinosaurs were long assumed to be. They were cognitively sophisticated animals navigating a complex environment with a suite of sensory and motor skills that required, and presumably produced, a brain of considerable capability. By the time the Cretaceous forests of Liaoning were alive with these small, feathered, fast, cognitively capable theropods, the trend toward miniaturization that had produced them had already been running for 50 million years. We will trace that trend in the chapter that follows, but for now, let the picture settle in your mind. Not the giants, not the monsters, but something much quieter, much more nimble, moving through the green shadows of a forest that no longer exists, alert to everything, hungry always, never still for long, building in its tiny hollow bones and its fast-firing neurons and its large searching eyes, a future that will outlast every giant that ever shook the earth with its footstep. Small, miraculous, almost too easy to miss, and in that almost too easy to miss quality, carrying the whole future of life as we know it. Among the most extraordinary stories in the entire history of life on Earth is one that happened so slowly, so incrementally, over such a staggering span of time, that it is almost impossible to hold in the mind as a single story at all. It took 50 million years. It involved hundreds of thousands of generations. It proceeded in fits and starts, with reversals and pauses and accelerations, with dead ends that led nowhere and innovations that changed everything. And at the end of it, an animal that had weighed several hundred pounds had become something that weighed, in its most extreme expression, about 2 grams. That story is the miniaturization of the theropod dinosaurs, and it is one of the most sustained and consequential evolutionary trends ever documented in the fossil record. We need to go back first to understand where the story begins. The theropod dinosaurs, the broad group that includes the tyrannosaurs and the velociraptors and the gigantic Spinosaurus, and also, yes, every bird that has ever lived, originated in the late Triassic period, roughly 230 million years ago. The earliest theropods were not enormous. They were relatively modest in size, perhaps a meter or 2 in length, bipedal, active, opportunistic predators that occupied a middle tier in the ecosystems of their time. But over the course of the Jurassic and into the Cretaceous, some lineages within the theropods grew very large indeed. Allosaurus, which patrolled the late Jurassic landscapes of North America, could reach 12 meters in length. Spinosaurus, from the Cretaceous of North Africa, was larger still. Tyrannosaurus rex, the most famous of them all, was a creature of such imposing mass and power that it remains, nearly a century after its discovery, a standard by which human beings measure the idea of danger. But here is what you may not know, and what represents one of the genuine revelations of late 20th and early 21st century paleontology. While some lineages within the theropods were growing larger and larger, another group was doing exactly the opposite. The clade known as Microraptor, which includes the raptors, the therizinosaurs, the oviraptorosaurs, and the birds and their closest non-avian relatives, was undergoing a sustained and remarkable process of size reduction that continued for more than 50 million years. Generation by generation, the animals in this lineage were getting smaller, not in every species, not without variation, not without the occasional reversal, but as a general trend, averaged across the lineage and the time, the Maniraptoran theropods were shrinking. The evidence for this comes from careful measurement and comparison of fossil specimens across geological time. When researchers plot the body mass of Maniraptorans against the geological age of their fossils, a clear pattern emerges. The earliest Maniraptorans, from the Middle and Late Jurassic, were relatively large, some comparable in size to a medium-large dog. Over the course of the next 50 million years, the average body mass of the lineage that led to birds declined steadily, with some branches getting dramatically smaller, even while others maintained larger sizes. By the early Cretaceous, the immediate precursors of birds were mostly crow-sized or smaller. By the time the first definitively avian animals appeared, the body mass of the lineage had dropped by orders of magnitude compared to its starting point. The question of why is the interesting one, and the honest answer is that we do not fully know. Evolution does not have intentions. It does not shrink animals because smallness is better, in some abstract sense. It shrinks animals because, in a specific environment with specific pressures and specific opportunities, the animals that happen to be slightly smaller have slightly more offspring, and over millions of generations that slight advantage accumulates into dramatic change. What specific pressures drove the sustained miniaturization of the Maniraptorans is still debated, but several candidates stand out. One is the ecological opportunity presented by forest canopy environments. As conifers and other tall trees diversified and spread through the Mesozoic, they created an enormous amount of three-dimensional habitat that was effectively inaccessible to larger animals. The insects, seeds, small lizards, and other resources that lived in the canopy represented a food source of considerable richness for any animal small enough to exploit it. Smaller animals could reach these resources, larger ones could not. Selection pressure would have favored, generation by generation, the slightly smaller individuals that could reach slightly higher branches, exploit slightly narrower niches, access slightly more of the available food supply. Another driver may have been predation pressure. In an ecosystem with large active predators, small body size confers the advantage of concealment. An animal that can hide completely behind a trunk, that fits into a space in the bark or a hollow in the wood, that can remain entirely motionless against a background it matches almost perfectly in color and texture, is an animal that predators cannot catch. This too would have been a consistent pressure over millions of years, always favoring the slightly smaller, slightly better hidden individual over the slightly larger, slightly more visible one. A third driver, and this one is perhaps the most counterintuitive, is reproductive strategy. Small animals reproduce faster than large ones. A crow reaches sexual maturity in 2 or 3 years and can raise multiple clutches of offspring per year. An elephant takes 15 years to reach sexual maturity and has, in good conditions, perhaps one calf every 4 to 5 years. The difference in reproductive rate is so dramatic that small animals can respond to changing environmental conditions much faster than large ones, simply because they produce more generations in a given span of time. In an environment that was changing, as the Mesozoic certainly was over its 180 million years, the ability to evolve rapidly may have been a significant advantage. Here is something that few people outside of specialist paleontology circles are aware of. The The miniaturization of the Maniraptoran lineage did not proceed smoothly and gradually. It happened in pulses. There were periods of rapid size decrease, followed by periods of relative stability, followed by further rapid decreases. This pulsed pattern suggests that specific environmental events, perhaps the opening of new ecological opportunities, perhaps episodes of intense predation pressure, perhaps climate shifts that restructured ecosystems, were triggering bursts of accelerated miniaturization at specific moments in geological time. Between those bursts, the lineage maintained roughly stable body sizes, as if waiting for the next set of conditions that would push selection in the direction of the small. The concept of ghost lineages is important here, and it is worth taking a moment to explain it, because it represents one of the most haunting aspects of paleontology. A ghost lineage is a branch of the evolutionary tree that we know must have existed, because its members appear in the fossil record, and because their existence implies a preceding lineage that we have not yet found. When you find a small feathered dinosaur in the Cretaceous that has characteristics pointing toward birds, and when you also find birds themselves in the same or slightly later deposits, you can infer that there must have been intermediate forms connecting them. But if those intermediate forms left no fossils that have survived to be found, they become ghost lineages, presences implied by their descendants, entities whose existence is certain but whose evidence is absent. The fossil record of the miniaturizing Maniraptorans is full of ghost lineages. For every species we have found, there were almost certainly dozens more that have left no trace. The animals at the very small end of the size spectrum, the ones most relevant to the question of the smallest dinosaurs, were precisely the ones least likely to be preserved. Their bones were thin and light and dissolved easily in mildly acidic sediment. Their small size made them easy for scavengers to overlook, which paradoxically meant they were often eaten whole and their bones scattered and destroyed rather than left in place to be buried. The most critical transitions in the miniaturization story are, almost by definition, the ones we are least likely to find. And yet we have found some of them, fossils that represent moments in the miniaturization story, snapshots of the process at specific instants in geological time, have emerged from Liaoning and from a handful of other remarkable fossil sites around the world. Each one adds a data point to the curve. Each one tells us something new, the thinnest possible trace of their existence in the sediment of a lake that no longer exists. There is something almost unbearably poignant about the ghost lineages of the small dinosaurs. They were alive, they were warm and quick, and probably noisy in the way that small, intense animals are noisy, full of the calls and signals and small sounds of creatures that communicate constantly because they live in complex social environments where information is survival. They ate and slept and raised their young and competed for territory and died, and all of that happened in a world that is now gone, and the only evidence that they were ever here at all is a ghost, an inference drawn from the shape of a family tree, a presence felt in the absences of the record. They were as real as anything that ever lived, and most of them are as lost as anything can be. The trend toward miniaturization accelerated most dramatically in the branch of the Maniraptorans that would eventually produce birds. By the late Jurassic, approximately 160 million years ago, there were small feathered theropods living alongside Archaeopteryx, the animal that has traditionally been called the first bird, though that designation has become complicated by subsequent discoveries. These creatures were crow-sized at most, and some were considerably smaller. They had long tails still, unlike modern birds, and clawed hands and teeth rather than beaks, but they were feathered, and they were small. And in the long view of history, they were already on their way to something new. The next chapter of this story belongs to some specific creatures whose fossils have emerged from the ancient lake beds and volcanic ashfalls of Liaoning and other sites to give us our clearest pictures of what the small dinosaurs actually looked like and how they moved and what they might have been doing in the forests of the ancient world. We are going to meet them one by one. But before we do, hold this image for a moment. A lineage of dinosaurs, some of them bipedal hunters originally built for speed and power, gradually, over 50 million years, becoming something else entirely. Something feathered and fast and light as a thought. Something that would outlast every other dinosaur by 66 million years and counting. Something that is, right now as you lie in the dark listening to this story, perched outside your window, or sleeping in a tree nearby, or crossing 1,000 miles of open ocean on wings that evolved from the arms of a creature that never flew at all. In the year 2003, a paper was published in the journal Nature that stopped the paleontological world in its tracks. The paper described a small dinosaur from Liaoning province in China, formerly named Microraptor Gi, and what it described was something that no one had fully anticipated, even though the hints had been building in the fossil record for years. Microraptor Gi, the authors reported, had 4 wings, not 2, 4, a pair of feathered wings on its arms, in the conventional arrangement that anyone familiar with birds or bats would recognize, and a second pair of feathered wings on its legs, with long, flight-capable feathers extending from the hind limbs in a configuration that had no exact parallel in the modern world. This was not a bird. It was not a conventional dinosaur. It was something else. Something that opened up a question about the evolution of flight, that had seemed settled and turned out to be anything but. To appreciate how startling this discovery was, you need to understand the state of the debate about flight origins before Microraptor arrived. There were, broadly speaking, 2 camps. The ground-up camp held that flight evolved in small running theropods that leaped and flapped and gradually developed the ability to sustain themselves in the air. The tree-down camp held that flight evolved in tree-climbing animals that glided between branches and eventually developed the powered flight that characterizes modern birds. Both camps had evidence. Both camps had passionate advocates. Neither camp had Microraptor, because Microraptor was neither a pure runner nor a pure glider. It was something more complicated and more interesting than either model had predicted. Its hind limb feathers were long and aerodynamically shaped, suggesting genuine contribution to lift generation. Its forelimb feathers were similar to those of modern gliding birds in their structure and orientation. The anatomy of its shoulder joint and its hind limb articulation suggested that it could spread all 4 sets of feathers simultaneously, creating a biplane-like configuration that would have been aerodynamically functional, capable of generating lift and managing the forces of gliding, or perhaps even early powered flight. Microraptor was telling a story that neither camp had written, and the story was more complex and more wonderful than either had imagined. The animal itself was, by any measure, small. Total body length, including the long bony tail, was somewhere between 40 and 90 centimeters depending on the individual and the specimen. Body mass estimates range from about half a kilogram to perhaps 1.5 kilograms, roughly the weight of a large crow or a small hawk. It was, by the standards of the theropod lineage, a tiny creature, and its tiny size was directly related to its aerodynamic capabilities. Smaller body mass means lower wing loading, which means better gliding performance, which means more ecological opportunity in the 3-dimensional world of the forest canopy. Microraptor was small because being small was what let it do what it did. The specimens from Liaoning have allowed paleontologists to reconstruct Microraptor in considerable detail. The feathers are preserved, which is extraordinary in itself, because feathers are fragile structures that usually decompose long before fossilization can occur. But the chemical conditions of the Liaoning lakebeds were particular, and the feathers of Microraptor were preserved with enough fidelity that their structure can be studied in detail. They were asymmetric, which is a feature of modern flight feathers, with the leading edge narrower than the trailing edge. This asymmetry is not present in display feathers or down feathers. It is a feature that serves an aerodynamic function, reducing drag and improving lift. Microraptor had flight-capable feathers on all 4 limbs, each one shaped by the same evolutionary pressure that shapes the flight feathers of every modern bird. In 2012, nearly a decade after the original Microraptor description, another team of researchers published a paper that added a new dimension to the story. They had used a technique called scanning electron microscopy to analyze the melanosomes, the pigment-containing structures, in the fossilized feathers of Microraptor. Melanosomes are preserved in fossilized feathers because they are dense enough to survive the fossilization process, and their shape and arrangement can tell us about the color that the feathers produced. In modern birds, different melanosome shapes produce different colors, and the relationship between melanosome structure and color is well enough understood that researchers can make reliable inferences about the colors of fossilized feathers from melanosome analysis alone. What they found in Microraptor was remarkable. The feathers were iridescent black, with a blue-green shimmer in certain lighting conditions, very similar to the iridescent plumage of a modern crow or a starling. Microraptor was not the mottled brown or grey that illustrated reconstructions had long imagined. It was glossy and dark and probably quite beautiful, in the particular way that iridescent creatures are beautiful, changing colour as they move through shifting light. This discovery of colour through melanosome analysis was itself one of the most revolutionary methodological advances in paleontology of the early 21st century, and we will return to it in a later chapter when we discuss what it has revealed about other small feathered dinosaurs. But the colour of Microraptor raises a question that is not easily answered. What was that iridescence for? In modern birds, iridescent plumage typically serves a social function. It is involved in mate choice, in species recognition, in the display behaviors that govern access to mates and territories. If Microraptor had iridescent plumage, it was almost certainly engaging in some form of social display, which in turn implies a social life, a recognition of conspecifics, a set of behavioral interactions between individuals of the same species that went well beyond the simple reflexive responses that dinosaurs were once assumed to be capable of. A creature with iridescent feathers is a creature for which other members of its species are important, for which appearance matters, for which the opinion of a potential mate or rival is a significant factor in its existence. The diet of Microraptor has been reconstructed from direct evidence, that is, in the world of paleontology, extraordinarily rare. Some specimens of Microraptor have been found with gut contents preserved, the remains of the animal's last meal preserved inside its rib cage by the same exceptional conditions that preserved everything else about these creatures. What did Microraptor eat? The answer varies by specimen. One individual had eaten a bird, a small avian dinosaur, not unlike the ones we will discuss in later chapters. Another had eaten a small lizard. A third appears to have consumed a small fish, which is remarkable because it suggests a hunting strategy that involved the water surface as well as the forest canopy. Microraptor was an opportunistic predator of small vertebrates, taking whatever was available and whatever it could catch, using its 4 wings and its speed and its excellent vision to pursue prey in 3-dimensional space, in a way that ground-bound predators simply could not match. Here is something worth sitting with for a moment as you rest. Microraptor lived approximately 125 million years ago, and it has been found in hundreds of specimens from Liaoning. Hundreds. For a creature of its small size, this is an extraordinary abundance in the fossil record, and it tells us that Microraptor was not a rare or marginal creature. It was abundant. It was successful. It was, by the metrics that matter in evolutionary biology, doing something extremely right. In an ecosystem that contained creatures of every size from insect to sauropod, a small, feathered, 4-winged gliding predator had found a niche that supported a large and thriving population for millions of years. That success, that abundance, speaks to the power of the ecological strategy that Microraptor had evolved. The descendants of Microraptor, or rather, the descendants of the lineage to which Microraptor belonged, eventually settled on 2 wings rather than 4. The hind limb feathers were reduced and eventually lost as the hind limbs became legs rather than wings, adapted for the perching and walking and running that characterizes most modern birds. But for a period in the early Cretaceous, 4-winged flight was apparently a viable option, a working solution to the problem of how to move through a 3-dimensional forest environment, and it worked well enough to produce the abundance and diversity that the Liaoning deposits record. There is something dreamlike about Microraptor that goes beyond the mere strangeness of its anatomy. It is the creature at a crossroads, the animal that had committed to a path that would eventually lead somewhere familiar, but that was still, in its own time, fully itself, fully adapted to its own world, not a transitional form in the dismissive sense, but a complete and successful creature, living a complete and successful life. The 4 wings were not a failed experiment. They were a working solution that served the lineage well for millions of years before the 2-wing arrangement proved to have advantages that ultimately prevailed. Evolution does not know where it is going. Every creature it produces is complete in itself. Microraptor was not a rough draft of a bird. It was Microraptor. And it was perfect at being Microraptor, and it glided through the dappled light of an early Cretaceous forest with a grace and efficiency that we can only partially reconstruct from the shapes left in stone. The Microraptor discovery opened a door that subsequent research has only pushed wider. If four-winged flight was possible, what other aerodynamic experiments had been run in the dinosaur lineage? If the hind limb feathers of Microraptor contributed to flight, what were the hind limb feathers of other small theropods doing? Were other species also using their leg feathers aerodynamically? Or had they been selected for display, or for thermoregulation, or for some function we have not yet considered? These questions have driven a wave of research into the feathered anatomy of small theropods, and the answers have continued to surprise. The more closely paleontologists look at the small end of the theropod size range, the more extraordinary the variety becomes. But Microraptor, for all its wonder, is not the end of this story. It is not even the smallest of the small feathered dinosaurs that we will meet tonight. It represents a particular point on the size spectrum, the point where gliding or flying becomes possible, but where the animal is still large enough to hunt small vertebrates actively, still large enough to leave clear and recoverable fossils with some regularity. Smaller than Microraptor, the creatures become harder to find, harder to describe, harder to place in the evolutionary story. Their bones are even more fragile. Their preservation is even more dependent on exceptional circumstances, and their place in the story of the smallest dinosaurs is even more central. Close your eyes for a moment and let the image of Microraptor take shape in the darkness behind them. It is perched in a conifer, perhaps 15 meters above the forest floor, its iridescent black feathers catching what little light filters through the canopy. Its large eyes are scanning the space below it, reading the movement of shadow and leaf for the telltale signs of something smaller than itself moving through the undergrowth. Its four wings are folded against its body, the hind limb feathers pressed close to its legs. When it launches, it will spread all four sets of feathers in a configuration we have no modern analogue for, and it will move through the forest air in a way that no creature before or since has quite duplicated. It is 125 million years ago. It is early morning. The lake below the trees reflects a sky that has not yet learned about clouds the way our sky knows them. And Microraptor is about to hunt. What were feathers for before they were for flying? This question, which might seem to have an obvious answer, turns out to be one of the most interesting and contested in all of paleontology. The obvious answer is that feathers evolved for flight, that the whole point of them, the reason they were selected for in the first place, was to allow small theropods to move through the air. But the fossil record, as it has been gradually and painstakingly assembled over the past several decades, tells a more complicated story. Feathers appear in the fossil record long before there is any evidence of flight capability. They appear on animals that were clearly not flyers, whose anatomy was incompatible with flight in any form we recognize. They appear in configurations that would have contributed nothing to aerodynamic performance, but that may have served entirely different purposes. And one of the most dramatic demonstrations of this comes from a small dinosaur called Epidexipteryx, whose tail feathers tell us something extraordinary about what feathers could be before they became the tools of flight. Epidexipteryx was discovered in the Jurassic deposits of Inner Mongolia and described in 2008. The animal was small, comparable in body size to a modern pigeon or small crow, with a skull that was large relative to its body, large eyes, and a set of teeth adapted for eating insects. Its forelimbs had a wing-like structure with some feathering, though whether it was capable of any meaningful aerial locomotion is disputed. But what made Epidexipteryx remarkable? What made researchers stop and look very carefully at the specimen and then look again? Was its tail. Most feathered dinosaurs had tail feathers arranged in a fan or a pair of elongated central feathers, all of them of the kind we recognize as flight or contour feathers, with a central shaft and barbs branching off to either side. Epidexipteryx had something completely different. 4 long ribbon-like feathers, thin and narrow, and utterly unlike flight feathers, extending from the end of its tail to a length that was, relative to the animal's body size, quite extraordinary. These ribbon feathers were not aerodynamic structures. They were not flight feathers or contour feathers or down feathers or any other kind of feather that serves an obvious functional role in modern birds. They were, in all probability, display structures. They were, in other words, the dinosaurian equivalent of the peacock's tail, or the bird of paradise's elaborate plumes, structures that had been selected for because they made their bearer more attractive to mates or more impressive to rivals, structures whose purpose was visual communication rather than aerodynamics or thermoregulation. Epidexipteryx was advertising something with those ribbons. It was saying something about itself to others of its kind. And the fact that those ribbons were feathers tells us that feather-based display is enormously old. Far older than flight, old enough to have been operating in the Jurassic forests of what is now Inner Mongolia. This is an important fact to sit with. Display structures made of feathers predate flight in the evolutionary history of feathers. We know this because Epidexipteryx lived in the Jurassic, well before the radiation of birds, and because its tail feathers are structurally incapable of contributing to flight. The feathers came first, then the elaboration of feathers for display, then the co-option of feathers for aerodynamic purposes. Or perhaps all of these things were happening simultaneously in different lineages, with different feather types being selected for different purposes in different ecological contexts. The story of feather evolution is not a single straight line, from simple insulating fuzz to elaborate flight feather. It is a branching, overlapping, complex history in which feathers were simultaneously being used for insulation, for display, for aerodynamic assistance, and for purposes we may not yet have imagined. The year after the Epidexipteryx description, another extraordinary small theropod was described from approximately the same period and the same general region. Yichi, formerly named in 2015, though specimens had been known for some years before, was a creature that made paleontologists do a double take at a level that Epidexipteryx, remarkable as it was, had not quite managed. Yichi, which translates from Mandarin as strange wing, had wings, but not the wings of Microraptor, not the flight feathers on extended forelimbs that characterize modern birds and their immediate dinosaur ancestors. Yichi had wings made of membrane, a thin, flexible skin stretched between an elongated bony strut attached to the wrist and the body, creating a structure that looked remarkably like the wing of a bat or a flying squirrel or a sugar glider. Yichi was, to put it plainly, a dinosaur with bat wings. Nothing like it had ever been described before. Nothing like it has been found since, though the family to which it belongs, the Scansoriopterygids, includes a few other species that show hints of similar features. The bat wing anatomy of Yichi represents an evolutionary experiment that has no modern analogue, a completely different solution to the problem of moving through three-dimensional space that was tried by at least one dinosaur lineage, and that apparently led nowhere, because the descendants of Yichi, if it had descendants, are not among us today. The wing membrane approach was abandoned in favor of the flight feather approach that characterizes modern birds. But for a period in the middle to late Jurassic, a small, strange creature with bat wings and feathers and large eyes was moving through the forests of what is now China, and the bony struts that supported its wings are preserved in the rock of Inner Mongolia, for anyone who knows how to read them. The body mass of Yichi has been estimated at roughly 230 grams, about the weight of a medium-sized chicken egg. It was tiny, even by the standards of the small feathered dinosaurs. And its anatomy suggests it was primarily a tree dweller, using its membrane wings to glide between trees in the way that modern flying squirrels do, without powered flight, but with enough aerodynamic control to choose a landing spot and arrive at it without injury. The Scansoriopterygid family to which Yichi belongs appears to have been composed entirely of small, tree-climbing animals, and we will meet more of them in the next chapter. But Yichi stands out within the family for its extraordinary wing structure, a structure so unexpected that when the first specimen was examined, researchers initially suspected they were looking at soft tissue from a different animal that had been accidentally associated with the dinosaur bones. What Yichi tells us, taken together with Epidexipteryx and Microraptor and the other small feathered dinosaurs of the Mesozoic, is that the aerial and semi-aerial experimentation in the dinosaur lineage was far more diverse than any model had predicted. We had assumed, for a long time, that the path from ground-dwelling theropod to flying bird was a single path, a narrow evolutionary corridor that one lineage moved through and all others did not. What the Chinese fossil beds have revealed is that the experimentation was widespread and varied, that multiple lineages were simultaneously trying different approaches to the challenge of moving through the air, and that the particular approach that ultimately gave rise to birds was just one of several options that were being explored at roughly the same time in roughly the same forests. The diversity of feather types in small theropods is itself remarkable and worth dwelling on. There were simple filamentous protofeathers, known as dino fuzz, that insulated the body the way mammal fur does. There were branching protofeathers that looked like an intermediate between a hair and a flight feather, with a central shaft and branches but no further organization. There were full flight feathers with a central rachis and organized barbs and barbules that interlock to create a flat, aerodynamically effective surface. There were the ribbon feathers of Epidexipteryx, narrow and ribbon-like, and clearly not aerodynamic. And there were the melanin-rich feathers that produced the iridescent colors we have been able to reconstruct from melanosome analysis. This is an extraordinary diversity of structures, all built from the same basic biological material, all evolved from the same ancestral structures, all serving different purposes in different animals at different moments in evolutionary history. The function of feathers before flight, insulation, is important and should not be dismissed simply because it is less dramatic than flight. Small warm-blooded animals in a world that could be cold needed insulation as urgently as any other adaptation. The fossil evidence suggests that feather-like structures appeared in the theropod lineage quite early, possibly as early as the Middle Triassic, tens of millions of years before any dinosaur took to the air. If this is true, and the evidence is compelling if not yet conclusive, then the original function of feathers was almost certainly thermoregulatory, a way of trapping a layer of warm air close to the body surface, reducing the rate of heat loss in animals whose high metabolic rates required them to maintain elevated body temperatures. The evolutionary journey from a simple insulating filament to the complex, aerodynamically sophisticated flight feather of a modern bird is one of the great stories of structural evolution. It involved changes in the protein chemistry of the feather, changes in the geometry of branching, changes in the organization of the microstructure, and changes in the developmental processes that produced the feather in the first place. And all of these changes happened gradually, incrementally, in small steps that each represented a marginal improvement over the previous state, until the accumulated improvements added up to something revolutionary. No single mutation created the flight feather. Hundreds of millions of small changes, across millions of generations, did. There is something quietly profound about standing at the beginning of that process, in the Jurassic forests, where Epidexipteryx trailed its ribbon feathers through the understory, and Yichi spread its strange membrane wings between the trees, and understanding that these creatures were part of an experiment so vast and so slow that no individual participant could have any awareness of it. They were not heading toward birds. They were not trying to become something different. They were simply living, finding food, evading predators, attracting mates with whatever signals they had evolved to produce, and in doing so, they were inadvertently carrying forward the genetic variations that would eventually, in some of their descendants, produce one of the most successful groups of animals in the history of life on Earth. The question of what feathers are for has become, in the light of all these discoveries, a question with a more complicated and more interesting answer than anyone imagined a few decades ago. Feathers are for warmth. Feathers are for display. Feathers are for signaling species identity. Feathers are for aerodynamic assistance in gliding. Feathers are for powered flight. And possibly, feathers are for purposes we have not yet identified. Functions that were relevant in specific ecological contexts that no longer exist and that left no evidence clear enough to decipher. The feather is an extraordinarily versatile biological structure, capable of serving many masters, and its versatility is part of what made it so successful across so many lineages and so many ecological contexts. As you rest and listen, picture the Jurassic forest as it might have appeared on an evening in that ancient world. The light is going golden and then orange, and then the particular deep blue that precedes full dark. In the canopy, Epidexipteryx is settling into a sleeping position, its ribbon feathers folded carefully, its large eyes beginning to close, as the insect activity that fed it through the day gives way to the cooler, darker patterns of night. Lower down, in the tangles of root and undergrowth, other creatures are beginning to move, the small nocturnal ones, drawn out by the cooling air and the increasing activity of the moths and beetles and other insects that thrive after dark. The air smells of resin and earth, and the faint sweetness of the first flowering plants just beginning to establish themselves at the margins of this ancient world. Tomorrow will be much like today, It will be much like yesterday, and it will be, in some almost imperceptible way, different from both, because in every generation, something is being tried, something is being tested, something is being kept or discarded by the only editor that evolution knows, which is the silence of a creature that dies without offspring. There is a question in paleontology that has been argued over for more than a century without full resolution, and it is worth visiting tonight because it speaks directly to the story of the small dinosaurs and where they spent their lives. The question is simply this: did flight evolve from the trees down or from the ground up? In the trees down model, the ancestors of birds were tree climbers who developed gliding and then powered flight as extensions of an arboreal lifestyle. In the ground up model, the ancestors of birds were fast-running ground predators who developed feathered forelimbs first for balance or for catching prey, and then gradually developed the ability to use those limbs for aerial assistance and eventually for flight. Both models have champions among paleontologists. Both models have evidence. And the discovery, over the past 30 years, of a group of small dinosaurs that appears to have been completely and unambiguously arboreal, has complicated the debate in ways that have made it more productive and more interesting. The group is called Scansoriopterygidae, which translates roughly as climbing wing lizards, though lizard is not quite the right word for them, and climbing wing does not quite capture their full character either. They are known from a small number of specimens, mostly from the Middle to Late Jurassic deposits of China, and they are among the most enigmatic and fascinating of all the small feathered dinosaurs. Their feet are the first thing that draws the eye when you examine a specimen, because the feet of Scansoriopterygids are profoundly different from the feet of other small theropods, different in ways that make a very clear statement about the lives these animals led. The feet of most small theropods are built for running. The toes are arranged with 3 functional toes pointing forward and a reduced or vestigial toe pointing backward or to the side, a configuration optimized for pushing off the ground efficiently at speed. The feet of Scansoriopterygids are built for gripping. The first toe, the hallux, which in most theropods is small and held off the ground, is large and positioned to oppose the other toes, creating a grasping structure that functions much like the foot of a modern perching bird. This arrangement is not useful for running. It is not compatible with the kind of fast bipedal locomotion that characterizes most small theropods. But it is extraordinarily useful for gripping a branch, for locking onto a surface and holding fast against the pull of gravity, for the kind of controlled, careful movement through a vertical world that tree climbing requires. The first Scansoriopterygid to be formally described was Epidexipteryx, which we have already met, and whose ribbon tail feathers told us something important about display before flight. But the family includes other members as well. Scansoriopteryx heilmanni, named in 2002 from a small specimen found in Liaoning, showed the same grasping foot anatomy and the same general body plan, small, lightweight, with large eyes suggesting good vision in conditions of variable light, and with the overall proportions of an animal that spent most of its time in the vertical world of tree trunks and branches rather than on the flat horizontal surface of the ground. Yi Qi, with its extraordinary membrane wings, belongs to this family as well, suggesting that the Scansoriopterygids as a group were experimenting quite broadly with the aerodynamic possibilities that a life in the trees provides. What would it have looked like to be a Scansoriopterygid moving through the forests of the Middle Jurassic? The world at that time was perhaps even more alien than the early Cretaceous forests we visited in the opening chapters. The Jurassic was, by the standards of the Mesozoic, a time of enormous ecological richness, but also of great ecological familiarity among dinosaur specialists, and great unfamiliarity to anyone accustomed to modern ecosystems. There were no flowering plants yet. The forests were coniferous, dominated by trees that would be recognizable to us as related to modern pines and araucarias and ginkgos, though they were not quite any of these modern things. Ferns and horsetails and cycads filled the understory. The air was warmer than today, and the carbon dioxide levels were higher, which meant faster plant growth and more abundant vegetation than in any modern forest. A Scansoriopterygid in this world would have moved through the forest vertically as naturally as we move horizontally. Its grasping feet would have locked onto bark with a security that larger animals could not achieve, allowing it to freeze in place on the underside of a branch or on the vertical surface of a trunk and become, to any predator moving below, simply part of the texture of the wood. Its large eyes would have scanned the bark surface for the insects that lived in every crack and crevice, the beetles and roaches and early ancestors of today's tree-dwelling invertebrates that were present in enormous abundance in a world where every standing tree was its own ecosystem. The debate about arboreal versus cursorial origin of flight is, in many ways, a debate about which of these two worlds, the vertical one of the tree trunk or the horizontal one of the ground, was the evolutionary proving ground for the features that eventually produced bird flight. The Scansoriopterygids are relevant to this debate because they demonstrate unambiguously that arboreal small dinosaurs existed and were part of the Mesozoic fauna. Whether the lineage that produced birds passed through a Scansoriopterygid-like stage, or whether it arrived at flight via a different route, remains uncertain. But the existence of the Scansoriopterygids makes the trees-down model considerably more plausible than it might otherwise seem. The grasping foot of Scansoriopterygids deserves more attention than it typically receives, because it represents one of the most important and least discussed innovations in the entire story of small dinosaur evolution. Modern perching birds, the passerines and all their relatives, that together constitute more than half of all living bird species, owe their extraordinary ecological success, in part, to a foot that grips automatically when the leg bends. This tendon locking mechanism means that a sleeping bird on a branch does not fall off, because the very act of relaxing causes the tendons in the foot to tighten, gripping the branch more firmly the more relaxed the bird becomes. Whether Scansoriopterygids had this mechanism we cannot know for certain, but the basic anatomical arrangement that makes it possible was there. Their grasping feet were the ancestral template for the perching feet of modern birds. Here is a fact worth holding in the dark, as quiet as a creature pressed against bark. Scansoriopteryx heilmanni was estimated to weigh roughly 160 grams. That is about the weight of a large lemon, or a small peach, or the hand of a newborn child. An animal of that mass, moving through the trees of a Jurassic forest with the agility and precision that its anatomy suggests, would have been almost invisible to ground-level predators. The vertical world of the tree trunk is not a world that most predators can easily access. A creature that lives there has, in some important sense, already solved the predation problem in the most fundamental way possible, not by being faster than its predators, or more armored, or more dangerous, but by living where the predators cannot follow. The feeding ecology of the Scansoriopterygids was almost certainly insectivorous, at least primarily. Their teeth are small and sharp, suited for catching and processing soft prey rather than for the crushing of seeds or the shearing of leaves. The insects of the Jurassic were extraordinarily diverse, including primitive forms of many modern groups, as well as entirely extinct lineages that left no descendants. For a small, tree-climbing dinosaur with good vision and a quick grasping response, this insect abundance would have been a reliable and inexhaustible food supply, available throughout the day and much of the night, requiring only the ability to find it and catch it, both of which the Scansoriopterygids were apparently well equipped to do. The Scansoriopterygids did not survive to the end of the Mesozoic. They are not among the ancestors of modern birds, or at least not among the direct ancestors, though the question of their precise relationship to the avian lineage is still being worked out. They appear to have flourished in the Jurassic, and then faded, perhaps outcompeted by other small feathered dinosaurs that were developing more effective aerial capabilities, perhaps affected by the ecological changes that attended the Jurassic-Cretaceous boundary, perhaps simply victims of the kind of extinction that claims so many evolutionary experiments before they have a chance to play out fully. Their lineage died, but the idea that they embodied, the idea of a small, feathered, tree-climbing dinosaur exploiting the vertical dimension of the forest world, that idea was preserved in other lineages, and it was that idea, that arboreal strategy, that ultimately gave rise to the powered flight of birds. There is a particular quality of attention that tree-climbing animals develop, a quality that is different from the attention of ground-dwelling animals and different from the attention of aerial animals. It is the attention of a creature that must constantly assess surfaces, that must evaluate the load-bearing capacity of a branch, that must judge distances between attachment points, that must make rapid decisions about routes through a three-dimensional maze where one wrong move means a fall of uncertain consequences. This kind of attention is cognitively demanding, and there is evidence that the Scansoriopterygids had brains that were reasonably well developed relative to their body size. brains that could support the kind of rapid, accurate spatial processing that arboreal life requires. As you let your breathing slow and your mind begin to release the grip on the day that it has been maintaining, let the image of a Scansoriopterygid come to you. It is small and light and quick, pressed against the bark of a Jurassic conifer, with the ease of something that has never known any surface but this one. Its feet grip the rough bark with a precision that requires no conscious effort. Its eyes scan the bark surface with a patience that is not patience exactly, but attentiveness, a constant low-level scanning for movement, for the gleam of a beetle, for the slight displacement of bark that indicates something alive beneath it. When it finds what it is looking for, the movement is quick and decisive, a dart of the head, a flash of the small sharp teeth, a moment of stillness, and then the scanning resumes. Above it, the canopy moves in the wind. Below it, somewhere in the undergrowth, something larger is moving, but it cannot reach here. And the Scansoriopterygid knows this, the way it knows everything, not through thinking, but through the accumulated wisdom of millions of years of ancestors who made the same calculations and mostly got them right. These were the tree climbers of the deep past, small, extraordinary, almost impossibly well adapted to their vertical world, carrying in their grasping feet and their sharp eyes and their quick small brains an approach to existence that would eventually, in the fullness of geological time, produce something that could leave the tree altogether and carry the vertical world with it into the open sky. We are not there yet. We will not be there for another 30 or 40 million years in this story, but the pieces are assembling. The strategy is working, and in a forest of Jurassic conifers, in the warm and resin-scented air of a world 160 million years old, something very small is holding on very tightly to the bark of a tree and looking down at the world below it with eyes that contain, in their evolutionary heritage, the entire future of flight. In the forests of what is now Myanmar, in the hill country known as Kachin State in the far north of the country, there is a substance buried in the earth that is unlike anything else that paleontology has to offer. It is amber, the fossilized resin of ancient trees, and it is approximately 99 million years old. That number deserves a moment of consideration. 99 million years, when this amber was still liquid resin, flowing from wounds in the bark of trees that have long since ceased to exist as species. The Cretaceous period was at its height. Dinosaurs were the dominant land animals. Flowering plants were just beginning to spread. The ancestors of every mammal larger than a small dog were cautious. Nocturnal creatures that kept themselves hidden from the large reptilian predators that commanded every ecosystem. The world that this amber was formed in is a world so distant and so alien that human imagination reaches for it and finds only the most fragmentary footholds, and yet the amber preserves it. That is the extraordinary quality of Burmese amber, as paleontologists have come to call it. The amber from the mines of Kachin State. It preserves things that stone cannot. Stone is a rough medium, a destructive medium in many ways. The process of fossilization in sedimentary rock requires compression, mineral replacement, the gradual substitution of biological material with inorganic compounds that preserve the shape of the original but not, usually, the finest structural details. Stone fossils of small creatures tell us the outline of a bone, the general shape of a feather, the approximate position of a body at the moment of death. But amber preserves the feather itself. Not the impression of it, but the actual structures, the barbs and barbules and microscopic cells, frozen in a medium that hardened around them before they could decay, that enclosed them in a chemical environment so stable that their molecular architecture survives 99 million years later, with a completeness that no other preservation mechanism can match. The amber mines of Kachin State were known to local people for centuries, and amber from this region has been traded along ancient routes for a very long time. For most of that history, it was valued as a gemstone, appreciated for its warm golden color and its clarity, sometimes for the insects or plant fragments trapped within it. But it was not until the late 20th and early 21st centuries that the scientific community began to understand what the Burmese amber actually contained. And when that understanding arrived, it came with something approaching awe. Specimens began to emerge from the mines that contained not just insects, not just plant fragments, but feathers. Feathers of extraordinary completeness, and structural fidelity, preserved in 3 dimensions, their microscopic details still intact after 99 million years of geological time. The first feathers identified from Burmese amber represented a revelation for paleontologists studying the evolution of avian and non-avian feather structures. They could see, in specimens small enough to hold between a thumb and forefinger, feather types that had never been seen before in fossil form, feather types that represented stages in the evolution of flight feather architecture that had previously been only hypothetically reconstructed from structural reasoning. They could see the transition from simple filamentous protofeathers to more organized branching structures. They could see early flight feathers with barb organization still imperfect but recognizable. They could see down feathers of extraordinary delicacy, their structure so fine that it would have been functionally identical to the down inside a modern bird's plumage. What did these feathers belong to? That is the question that sits at the heart of the amber paleontology of the Cretaceous. And the honest answer is that in most cases, we do not know with certainty. A feather in amber is a feather without a body. Most of the time, the amber typically preserves a patch of plumage, a segment of wing, occasionally a complete foot or tail tip, but rarely an entire animal. Identifying the source of a feather requires comparing its structure to known feathers from known animals. And this comparison is sometimes diagnostic and sometimes deeply ambiguous. Some of the feathers from Burmese amber clearly belong to early birds, animals in the lineage that includes all modern birds. Others appear to come from non-avian theropods, small feathered dinosaurs that were not birds in any meaningful sense. And some fall into a category that is genuinely unclear, feathers whose structural characteristics are consistent with either avian or non-avian theropod origins, feathers that sit at the boundary between 2 categories that, 99 million years ago, were considerably less distinct than we tend to assume. There are, in the scientific literature, specimens of feathers from Burmese amber that paleontologists believe may represent species that have never been formally described. Not just undiscovered species, but species for which we have so far found only feathers, no bones, no complete body parts, nothing that would allow a formal taxonomic description. These ghost species are known only by the traces of their plumage, preserved by a substance that flowed from a tree wound 99 million years ago and enclosed whatever happened to fall into it or land on it before it hardened. They may have been small non-avian dinosaurs. They may have been early birds. They may have been something that does not fit neatly into either category. We do not know, and without bones, we may never know. The emotional quality of working with Burmese amber is, by the accounts of the scientists who do it, unlike anything else in paleontology. When you look at a stone fossil, you are looking at an impression, a shape where something was. When you look at a feather in amber, you are looking at the thing itself. The color is gone, because the organic pigments that produced color in life have mostly degraded over 99 million years. But the structure is there. The physical feather, the same feather that once grew from the skin of a living animal and was maintained and preened and used and finally shed or detached in whatever circumstances led to its being enclosed in resin. There is a quality of presence to amber specimens that stone fossils do not have, a sense that you are looking not through a window in time but directly at the time itself. Several complete or near-complete small vertebrates have been found in Burmese amber, and each one has been a major event in the paleontological world. A small lizard in amber, preserved well enough that the scales on its skin are individually visible. Tiny frog species that gave us our clearest picture yet of Cretaceous amphibian diversity, and, in a discovery that we will examine in considerable detail in the next chapter, a small skull of something that was initially described as possibly the smallest known Mesozoic vertebrate, a description that turned out to be more complicated than it seemed. The potential of Burmese amber for vertebrate paleontology is difficult to overstate, because amber preserves precisely those small, delicate, surface-dwelling animals that the sedimentary fossil record almost never captures. The relationship between the amber and the forest that produced it is itself worth considering, because it tells us something about the ecology of the world these small creatures inhabited. The trees that produced the resin were coniferous, distant relatives of modern trees in the family Araucariaceae, the family that today includes the monkey puzzle tree and the Norfolk Island pine. These trees produce resin in response to injury, flooding the wound with sticky fluid that hardens into a protective seal. Anything that came into contact with fresh resin, an insect landing on the bark, a small lizard stepping across a resin flow, a feather falling from a bird in a tree above, might become enclosed if the resin continued to flow and eventually hardened around it. The randomness of what was preserved is extraordinary. The amber does not sample the fauna systematically. It samples whatever happened to interact with resin flows, which was determined by chance, by behavior, by the particular microhabitats in and around the resin-producing trees. This means that the amber record is both extraordinarily rich and profoundly incomplete in ways that are impossible to fully characterize. We have, from Burmese amber, a window into the small invertebrate life of the Cretaceous that is without parallel anywhere in the fossil record. We have glimpses of small vertebrates. We have feathers from unknown owners. But we do not have a representative sample of the fauna. We have a sample of what happened to be in the right place at the right time to fall into resin, and that sample is inevitably biased in ways we can only partially correct for. The animals and plants that never came near a resin-producing tree are invisible in the amber record, however abundant they may have been in the living ecosystem. There is something humbling about this limitation, because it applies not just to amber but to the fossil record as a whole, and to our understanding of the diversity of small dinosaurs in particular. The fossil record preserves a sample. It is a good sample, in many respects, better than we might have hoped given the destructive forces that operate over geological time, but it is a sample biased towards specific preservation environments, specific body sizes, specific types of organisms. The small, the soft-bodied, the arboreal, the marine in open water rather than marine in sediment, these are systematically underrepresented. And among the dinosaurs, this bias falls hardest on exactly the creatures we are most interested in tonight. The smallest, the most delicate, the tree-dwelling and canopy-living feathered theropods that left their traces, when they left any traces at all, in the rarest and most exceptional preservational environments. Amber, with all its limitations, is our best window into that lost world of small and delicate Cretaceous life. Each new specimen from the Kachin mines represents a potential revelation, a glimpse of something that would otherwise be entirely beyond our knowledge. The scientific community has had to grapple, in recent years, with the ethical questions that arise from the fact that the amber mining in Kachin State occurs in a region with a complex and sometimes troubled political and humanitarian situation, and these questions are real and important and deserve serious attention. But the scientific value of the specimens that have been studied is beyond question. They have told us things about the small creatures of the Cretaceous that we could not have known in any other way. The feathers in the amber are patient. They have been patient for 99 million years, enclosed in their golden medium, waiting for nothing, requiring nothing, simply persisting in the chemical stasis that amber provides. When a researcher holds a piece of Burmese amber up to the light and sees the barbs of a Cretaceous feather refracting the sunlight, there is a connection being made across a distance of time so great that it barely registers as time at all. It registers instead as something else, as the particular vertigo of understanding that you are looking at something alive that has been alive, in the extended sense of preservation, longer than the human lineage has existed, longer than the first stone tools, longer than the first fire, longer than the first human thought that could be called a thought in any sense we would recognize. Rest now. Let the amber world recede a little, taking its feathers and its resin and its ancient forest with it, back into the deep time where it belongs. What remains is the knowledge that those feathers existed, that the creatures that grew them were real and alive and moving through a world 99 million years gone, and that the amber, by some chemical accident of preservation, has kept them long enough for us to find them and understand, in a partial and provisional way, what they were. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, something extraordinary. The kind of extraordinary that tends to arrive quietly, in the form of a golden piece of resin no bigger than a walnut, held up to the light in the right moment and at the right angle. If you are still here, still drifting through these ancient forests with me, it means the story is doing what it was made to do. Let yourself go a little further. The world outside can wait. Subscribe if you have not already, so the next journey is waiting when you return. On the 11th of March, 2020, the journal Nature published a paper describing a tiny skull preserved in Burmese amber. The skull was 7.1 millimeters long, that is smaller than a human fingernail. It was smaller than the skull of any known Mesozoic vertebrate, and the researchers who described it, a team led by paleontologist Jingmai O'Connor and including specialists from several countries, named the animal Oculudentavis hongre, which translates roughly as ancient toothed bird eye, in reference to its enormous eyes and its small, tooth-bearing jaws. The paper reported that Oculudentavis represented the smallest known Mesozoic vertebrate, and it suggested that the animal might be the smallest known Mesozoic dinosaur, a potential winner of the prize we have been tracing through this story. The world's smallest dinosaur, perhaps. Finally found. The specimen was extraordinary to look at, preserved in a piece of translucent amber from the Kachin deposits. It showed a complete skull in 3 dimensions, with the proportions of something quite unlike anything that had been described before. The eye sockets were enormous relative to the skull, vastly larger than those of any comparable modern bird, suggesting eyes of a size that would have given extraordinary visual acuity or extraordinary light-gathering capacity, or both. The jaws were slender and bore small, sharp teeth, the kind of teeth associated with an insectivorous or carnivorous diet. The overall proportions, the researchers argued, were consistent with a hummingbird-like animal, small and fast, and dependent on extremely precise visual processing for hunting tiny prey. The paper generated an enormous amount of attention both within the scientific community and in the wider world. Newspaper headlines announced the discovery of the world's smallest dinosaur. Social media shared reconstructions of a tiny, wide-eyed creature that looked something like a cross between a hummingbird and a very small lizard. Paleontologists who had spent their careers working on small feathered dinosaurs found their specialty suddenly in the news in a way that it rarely is. The discovery seemed to be exactly the kind of story that bridges the gap between specialist science and public fascination. A tiny, ancient creature, beautifully preserved, representing an extreme of something. The smallest, always a category that captures human attention. But from the beginning, there were voices of caution. The initial paper acknowledged significant uncertainty about the taxonomic placement of Oculudentavis, about where exactly it sat in the family tree of vertebrates. The enormous eyes, while striking, were more extreme than those of any known bird, ancient or modern. The skull proportions were unusual in ways that were difficult to fully reconcile with known avian anatomy. And the teeth, while the presence of teeth in early birds is not surprising, were arranged in a pattern that did not entirely match the patterns seen in other small-toothed birds from the Cretaceous. These anomalies were noted and discussed in the original paper, but the overall interpretation, that this was a very small bird or bird-like dinosaur, was maintained. The questions about the paper began to intensify in the weeks after its publication. Paleontologists working on lizard evolution in particular began to raise concerns. The skull features that had been interpreted as bird-like, they pointed out, had alternative explanations. The enormous eye sockets, in particular, are not a feature unique to birds. Several groups of lizards have very large eyes relative to skull size, especially in species that are nocturnal or that live in environments where visual acuity is particularly important. The skull shape as a whole, when examined with an eye toward lizard rather than bird anatomy, began to look less like a bird and more like something else entirely. The resolution came in a way that illustrates something important about how science works. A second specimen of Oculudentavis was found in a different piece of Burmese amber. This specimen was less well preserved in some ways, but showed more of the body, more of the postcranial anatomy, more of the details that are needed to place an animal in the vertebrate family tree with confidence. And when this second specimen was examined, it told a different story than the first. The features visible in the new specimen were not consistent with a bird. They were consistent with a lizard, specifically with a group of lizards called the squamates, the group that includes all modern lizards and snakes. Oculudentavis was not a dinosaur. It was not a bird. It was a lizard that happened to be very small and that happened to have very large eyes, a combination of features that, in the absence of the postcranial anatomy, had been misleading. In July of the same year, just 4 months after the original paper was published, the Nature paper was retracted. Retraction is a rare and serious event in scientific publishing. It means that the conclusions of the paper are no longer considered valid, that the evidence has been found to be insufficient or the interpretation wrong. and that the scientific record needs to be corrected. The retraction of the Oculudentavis paper was handled with care and professionalism by all involved. The authors of the original paper acknowledged the new evidence and agreed with the retraction. A new paper was published reclassifying Oculudentavis as a lizard and describing the second specimen that had provided the key evidence for that reclassification. What does this story tell us? It tells us several things, and all of them are worth holding on to. First, it tells us that amber specimens, for all their extraordinary preservation, can be deeply ambiguous. A skull without postcranial anatomy is a skull without its context, and context in paleontology is often the difference between a correct interpretation and a wrong one. The researchers who initially described Oculudentavis were working with excellent intentions and rigorous methods from the evidence they had. The evidence they had was insufficient to support the conclusion they drew. That is not a failure of rigor. It is the inherent limitation of working at the edge of knowledge. Second, the story tells us something about the speed with which the scientific community can correct itself when new evidence becomes available. 4 months from publication to retraction is, by the standards of scientific publishing, nearly instantaneous. The system worked. The new specimen was examined. The implications were understood. The correction was made, and the record was updated. This is how science is supposed to function, and in the case of Oculudentavis, it functioned well. The retraction attracted less attention than the original paper, as retractions almost always do, but it was no less significant scientifically. Third, and perhaps most interesting for our purposes tonight, the Oculudentavis story illustrates the profound difficulty of identifying very small ancient vertebrates from fragmentary evidence. At the small end of the size spectrum, the diagnostic features that allow taxonomists to identify a specimen as a bird versus a lizard versus a small mammal can be subtle, and a skull without a body has genuinely limited diagnostic power. This difficulty is not unique to Oculudentavis. It applies to every small specimen from every ancient deposit, and it is one of the reasons why our understanding of the small end of Mesozoic vertebrate diversity remains so incomplete. The story of Oculudentavis also raises a question that has no easy answer. If the world's smallest Mesozoic vertebrate was initially misidentified as a bird when it was actually a lizard, how confident can we be in other identifications at the small end of the size spectrum? This is not a reason for despair. It is a reason for the kind of productive humility that drives good science. The recognition that the current state of knowledge is provisional, that new specimens change the picture, and that the willingness to revise interpretations in the light of new evidence is not a weakness of the scientific enterprise, but one of its defining strengths. The search for the world's smallest non-avian dinosaur continues, and we will arrive at the current best candidates in subsequent chapters. But it is worth pausing here to appreciate the Oculudentavis episode, not as a failure, but as a demonstration of scientific integrity in action. The question was asked. An answer was proposed. The answer turned out to be wrong. The answer was corrected. The question remains open. And its remaining open is precisely what makes it interesting. What keeps paleontologists looking? What keeps the story moving forward? Science that never revises its conclusions is not science. It is orthodoxy. And the story of the smallest dinosaurs is very much a scientific story, in all the messy and productive and self-correcting glory that scientific stories can have. Perhaps the most interesting legacy of the Oculudentavis episode is the way it focused attention on the question of what the smallest Mesozoic vertebrates actually were. Before the paper, the question had been present in the scientific literature, but not prominently. After the paper and the retraction, there was a heightened awareness of how little we know about the smallest creatures of the ancient world, and a renewed appreciation for the difficulty of studying them. New specimens from Burmese amber and from other exceptional preservation sites began to be examined with the Oculudentavis episode in mind, with a greater awareness of the taxonomic ambiguities that can arise at small sizes, and with a greater emphasis on securing postcranial anatomy before drawing taxonomic conclusions. Let the story settle into the quiet around you. A tiny skull, smaller than your thumbnail, preserved in amber for 99 million years, pulled from the earth and placed under a microscope, and initially misidentified, and then correctly identified, and in the process telling us something important about how hard it is to find and recognize the smallest creatures of the Rhind. Ancient world. The amber holds other things still. Other tiny skulls, other fragments, other samples of a fauna so small that we are still, in many respects, only beginning to understand it. They are patient. They have been patient for a very long time, and when we find them, which we will, they will add their voices to a story that is still being told. If you want to understand why our knowledge of small dinosaurs is so fragmentary and so full of gaps, you need to think about bones. Specifically, you need to think about what happens to small bones when an animal dies. The process is not gentle, and it is not kind to small things. When a large dinosaur dies, its bones are substantial. The femur of a large sauropod is a meter or more long and weighs dozens of kilograms. Even after death and decomposition and the work of scavengers, bones of that size are difficult to destroy entirely. They persist. They get buried. They become stone over millions of years, and they survive to be found by humans digging in the appropriate rock formations. This is why we have so many large dinosaur fossils, not because large dinosaurs were the most abundant, but because their bones were the most robust, the most likely to survive the long process of fossilization. The bones of small dinosaurs, by contrast, are fragile. A small feathered theropod the size of a crow has leg bones perhaps 10 centimeters long and no thicker than a pencil. Its ribs are slivers of bone, barely a millimeter wide. Its skull is a delicate lattice of thin bone plates, evolved to be as light as possible. And light bone is bone with minimal mass, which means minimal structural substance, which means minimal resistance to the forces of compression and dissolution that operate on buried material over millions of years. Small bones dissolve in slightly acidic groundwater. Small bones are crushed by the weight of sediment above them. Small bones are scattered by the scavenging activities of insects and small vertebrates before burial can occur. Small bones are missed by sediment flow and may travel downstream to be deposited far from where the animal died, in conditions where preservation is less likely. The result of all these taphonomic processes, to use the technical term for the processes that determine what gets preserved and how, is a fossil record that is systematically and profoundly biased against small animals. This bias is not unique to dinosaurs. It applies across the entire vertebrate fossil record, and its effects become more severe the smaller you go. At the very small end of the spectrum, at the size of creatures like the Scansoriopterygids or the smallest known non-avian theropods, the fossil record is so sparse that a single specimen can represent the entirety of our knowledge of an entire species. How sparse are we talking? Here is a way to think about it. Paleontologists have estimated, through various modeling approaches, that the fossil record preserves something on the order of 1 to 3% of all species that have ever lived. That estimate applies across all body sizes and all time periods and all environments. For small animals in ancient environments, the number is certainly lower. For small animals in environments that are not conducive to fossilization, lower still. The small feathered dinosaurs of the Mesozoic, living in forests where the conditions for preservation were generally poor, leaving bones that were particularly vulnerable to destruction, may be represented in the fossil record at a rate far below even that 1 to 3% figure. We may have found fossils of 1 in 100 species, or 1 in 1,000, or fewer. This is not a counsel of despair. It is context. The fossils we do have are extraordinary, and the information they contain is real and valuable. But it is important to maintain the appropriate epistemic humility about what the current state of knowledge represents. When we say that Microraptor was among the smallest non-avian dinosaurs, we mean among the smallest that we have found, which is not the same thing at all as among the smallest that existed. There were, almost certainly, small feathered theropods in the Mesozoic that were smaller than Microraptor, that weighed less than Epidexipteryx, that occupied ecological niches at the very small end of the vertebrate size spectrum. We have not found them. We may never find them. But they were there. The techniques that paleontologists use to find small fossils are themselves interesting, and they have improved dramatically over the past several decades. The most important technique is screen washing, also called microvertebrate prospecting. The process involves collecting large quantities of sediment from promising fossil-bearing formations and passing it through a series of progressively finer wire mesh screens, washing away the finer particles with water while retaining anything solid, The residue that remains after washing is then examined under a magnifying glass or a low-power microscope, and any bone fragments, teeth, or other biological structures are identified and removed for further study. Screen washing is slow, labor-intensive, and requires a considerable investment of time and resources, but it finds things that no amount of surface prospecting would ever reveal. The teeth of small theropods are particularly useful for screen washing because teeth are composed of enamel, which is much harder and more resistant to dissolution than bone. A small feathered dinosaur might leave no other trace in the sediment, but its teeth, if they are there, can survive long enough to be found by screen washing even when the bones themselves have entirely disappeared. Theropod teeth are distinctive in shape, with serrated edges and a recurved, laterally compressed form that makes them identifiable even as isolated fragments. The presence of theropod teeth in a sediment sample tells us that theropods were present, even if we have no other evidence of their presence, and the size of the teeth gives us a rough indication of the body size of the animals they came from. CT scanning has revolutionized the study of small specimens in ways that were unimaginable even 30 years ago. A small fossil, fragile and embedded in matrix from which full preparation would be impossible, can now be scanned to produce a three-dimensional digital image of extraordinary resolution that allows researchers to examine every detail of the specimen without touching it. Internal structures that would be destroyed by physical preparation can be visualized digitally. The precise geometry of bones can be measured to a degree of precision that permits functional analysis. Specimens that have sat in museum drawers for decades, considered too fragmentary or too poorly preserved to warrant study, can be re-examined using CT technology and found to contain information that was never previously accessible. And this brings us to a fact that should be mentioned explicitly because it represents an important and underappreciated dimension of the small dinosaur story. Many of the small fragmentary specimens that have been collected from Mesozoic fossil sites over the past century and a half have never been formally studied. They sit in the collections of natural history museums around the world, labeled with basic collection information, waiting. The collections of major natural history museums contain hundreds of thousands of specimens, and the staff available to study them is a small fraction of what would be needed to examine all of them in detail. A small, fragmentary specimen from a site where larger animals are the primary focus of collection may receive a cursory examination and a label and be placed in a drawer for years or decades before anyone looks at it carefully. There are documented cases of important small dinosaur specimens sitting in museum collections for years or decades before their significance was recognized. Sinosauropteryx, the first non-avian dinosaur found with clear evidence of protofeathers, had been in a private collection for some time before it was formally described in 1996. Other specimens have been found in museum collections during broad reviews, identified as belonging to species previously unknown and described as new species long after the original collection event. The history of paleontology is in part a history of rediscovery, of looking more carefully at things that were already in hand and finding that they contained more than was initially recognized. The democratization of paleontological research through new technologies has opened up possibilities that would have been unthinkable in earlier eras. Micro-CT scanners that were once available only at major research institutions can now be accessed by researchers at smaller institutions or through shared facilities. Digital imaging technology has made it possible to share three-dimensional models of specimens with researchers around the world, enabling collaborative analysis on a scale that physical access to specimens would never permit. The global network of researchers working on small Mesozoic vertebrates has grown dramatically, bringing perspectives and expertise from multiple disciplines and multiple geographical traditions to questions that were once addressed by small numbers of specialists. There is also, it should be said, an important contribution from amateur fossil collectors and from the communities around fossil sites, particularly in China. The Liaoning discoveries, which have done more than any other fossil site to advance our understanding of small feathered dinosaurs, began with locally collected specimens that were recognized by professional paleontologists as scientifically important. Local farmers and collectors in the Liaoning region were aware of the fossil-bearing potential of the sediments they worked around for years before the international scientific community began systematic excavation. Their knowledge of the local geology and their ability to recognize unusual fossils in the field has been indispensable. The problem of finding the very small is, in the end, a problem without a complete solution. We will never recover fossils of all the small dinosaur species that ever lived. The preservation bias is too severe, the losses over geological time too great. But we can do better than we have done, and we are doing better. Screen washing, micro-CT scanning, broadened collector networks, renewed attention to museum collections, improved international collaboration, all of these are expanding what we know and will continue to expand it. The picture of small dinosaur diversity that we will have in 50 years will be considerably richer than the picture we have today. Just as today's picture is considerably richer than what was known 50 years ago, the story is not over. It is not even, in the grand scheme of things, very far along. As you rest and let the day soften around you, hold this thought. Somewhere in the sediment of a formation that has not yet been excavated, or in a museum collection drawer that has not yet been reviewed with fresh eyes, there are bones. Small bones, fragile bones, the bones of creatures that were alive and active and purposeful 100 million years ago. Moving through forests of ancient conifers, hunting insects in the pre-dawn dark, pressing their grasping feet against bark that is now stone, watching the world with eyes that are now empty sockets in tiny skulls that may never be found. They are there. We know they are there. And the work of finding them is the patient, humble, never-finished work of understanding the past, which is never as simple or as complete as we would like it to be, and never as lost as it might sometimes seem. There is a statement in modern paleontology that still surprises many people when they encounter it for the first time, even though it has been the scientific consensus for decades. Birds are dinosaurs, not descended from dinosaurs, not related to dinosaurs, not analogous to dinosaurs in some metaphorical sense. Birds are dinosaurs, in exactly the same way that humans are primates, in exactly the same way that dolphins are mammals, in exactly the same way that any group is part of the larger group from which it evolved. When you look at a pigeon on a city sidewalk, you are looking at a dinosaur. When you watch a hawk riding a thermal above an open field, you are watching a dinosaur hunt. When you hear a rooster crow before dawn, you are hearing a dinosaur announce the morning. The feathered, warm-blooded, egg-laying bipedal creatures that share our world today are not the successors of the dinosaurs. They are the survivors. The scientific case for this is so solid that it is no longer seriously disputed within vertebrate paleontology. The evidence comes from multiple directions simultaneously. Skeletal anatomy shows that birds share hundreds of derived skeletal features with small theropod dinosaurs, features that are not present in other reptile groups and that appear to have evolved progressively in the theropod lineage over tens of millions of years before birds appear in the fossil record. Soft tissue evidence, from the preserved feathers of small theropods to the traces of air sac systems in their bones, shows that birds and small theropods shared fundamental aspects of their physiology as well as their anatomy. Molecular evidence from modern birds' genomes, while it cannot directly access the genomes of extinct non-avian dinosaurs, is consistent with a theropod origin in all the ways that modern molecular phylogenetics can assess. The case is complete. Birds are theropod dinosaurs. And the extinction at the end of the Cretaceous did not kill all the dinosaurs. It killed the non-avian dinosaurs. The others survived. How did they survive? The question is not as simple as it might appear. The asteroid impact that ended the Cretaceous 66 million years ago was a catastrophe almost beyond description. The immediate effects included wildfires across much of the planet, a tsunami of energy and debris, a global winter caused by dust and aerosols blocking the sun. The longer-term effects included massive disruption of the food chains that sustained the large animals of the Cretaceous. The survivors were, for the most part, small. They were the animals that could find shelter, that could subsist on whatever organic matter was available in the chaos of the aftermath, that could tolerate the fluctuations in temperature and food availability that the post-impact world imposed. Small body size was, in the immediate aftermath of the impact, a tremendous advantage. Among the theropod dinosaurs that survived the end Cretaceous extinction were several lineages of small, feathered, already bird-like animals. Some were what we would call birds in the full modern sense, animals that had already evolved the full suite of avian features, including beaked skulls without teeth, fused tail vertebrae, forming a structure called the pygostyle, a wishbone, and the specialized shoulder and wing anatomy associated with powered flight. Others were slightly more basal, retaining some features that we associate with non-avian theropods, teeth perhaps, or more mobile tail vertebrae. In the chaos and darkness and cold of the impact aftermath, these small, feathered, behaviorally flexible animals survived on seeds, on insects, on whatever they could find, and they eventually inherited a world from which the giants had been removed. The diversification of birds after the end Cretaceous extinction is one of the most rapid and dramatic in the history of life. Within a few million years of the impact, birds had diversified from a handful of surviving lineages into a spectacular array of ecological forms, filling the niches left vacant by extinct dinosaurs, mammals, and other groups. Waterfowl, shorebirds, raptors, owls, parrots, songbirds, the vast and diverse world of modern birds assembled itself with extraordinary speed in evolutionary terms, driven by the abundant, empty ecological space that the extinction had created. The world that emerged from the post-impact chaos was, from the perspective of birds, a world of opportunity, and they took that opportunity with a thoroughness that has resulted in more than 10,000 species of living birds today. 10,000 species of living dinosaurs. It is worth saying that number again and letting it settle into the mind, because it is easy to underappreciate it. The diversity of modern birds, the sheer variety of forms and sizes and ecological strategies and behavioral repertoires that the avian lineage has produced, is as great as or greater than the diversity of any other vertebrate group on Earth, greater than the diversity of all living mammals, greater than the diversity of all living reptiles, greater than the diversity of all living amphibians. Birds are, by any measure of species count, the dominant vertebrate group on land. And they achieved this dominance not in spite of their dinosaur ancestry, but because of it, because the deep evolutionary history of the theropod lineage had already built into them the metabolic intensity, the behavioral flexibility, the reproductive capacity, and the ecological versatility that allowed them to exploit the post-extinction world so effectively. The miniaturization that began in the Jurassic and continued through the Cretaceous was a necessary precondition for all of this. Large body size, so advantageous for a predator in a world with large prey and a stable climate, becomes a liability when food is scarce and shelter is needed. And the rules of survival have been suddenly and catastrophically rewritten. The small theropods that would eventually give rise to birds had been getting smaller for 50 million years before the impact. By the time the end Cretaceous extinction occurred, the avian lineage was already small enough, already flexible enough, already capable of surviving on minimal resources for long enough to make it through the bottleneck that killed everything larger. Size was destiny, smallness was salvation. There is a poetic symmetry to this that deserves a moment of contemplation. The dinosaur lineage began in the Triassic, as small, marginal creatures living in the shadows of larger and more dominant animals. The ecological release produced by the Carnian pluvial episode, that 2 million years of rain we discussed earlier in this story, gave them room to expand and diversify, and they became the giants that defined the Mesozoic. But within that dynasty of giants, the smallest branch of the theropod family was quietly becoming smaller still, refining its feathers and its flight capability and its metabolic intensity, moving towards something new. And when the asteroid came and the giants fell, it was the small branch, the descendant of that 50 million year miniaturization trend that walked out of the ashes and into the emptied world. The dinosaurs came to dominance through smallness, and they survived extinction through smallness. The smallness was always the key. Modern birds show us, in living form, what the end point of the miniaturization trend looks like. The variation in size among living birds is itself remarkable. The ostrich can weigh over 150 kilograms, roughly the mass of a large adult human. The bee hummingbird, which we will visit in the next chapter, weighs less than 2 grams. Between those extremes lies an almost incomprehensible range of sizes and shapes and ecological strategies, all built on the same basic theropod body plan that the Triassic ancestors of the dinosaur lineage established 230 million years ago. The body plan is extraordinarily flexible, capable of producing a creature that stands taller than most humans, and a creature that weighs less than a single grape from the same ancestral template. The features that make birds recognizable as birds are all features that were already present, in various stages of development, in small non-avian theropods. Feathers. present in multiple theropod groups tens of millions of years before the first birds. Hollow bones, present in theropods from early in the group's history. Air sac respiratory system, present in many non-avian theropods, as evidenced by the characteristic pneumatic openings in their vertebrae. Wishbone, present in many non-avian theropods. High metabolic rate, strongly suggested by the anatomy of small theropods and confirmed, in some cases, by growth ring analysis of their bones. Bipedal posture, present throughout the theropod lineage. The list continues. Birds did not invent these features. They inherited them. They are the inheritors of a 230 million year evolutionary experiment in the advantages of being a theropod dinosaur. The avian lung deserves special mention because it is among the most extraordinary organs in the vertebrate body. The bird lung does not expand and contract like the mammalian lung. Instead, it is rigid, attached to the ribcage, and air flows through it in one direction, driven by a series of air sacs that act as bellows. This means that fresh, oxygen-rich air is always flowing over the gas exchange surfaces of the lung, unlike in the mammalian lung where the air mixes and the efficiency of gas exchange is lower. The bird lung is so efficient that birds can fly at altitudes where the air is too thin for mammals to function. They can sustain the extreme metabolic demands of powered flight in conditions that would rapidly incapacitate a mammal of comparable size. And this extraordinary respiratory system, which is one of the defining features of modern birds, was already being assembled in the non-avian theropod ancestors of birds, with air sac systems evident in fossils from the Jurassic and Cretaceous. The living dinosaurs are around us every day, and most of us do not think of them in those terms. The sparrow on the windowsill is a dinosaur. The crow that picks through the garbage is a dinosaur. The eagle that floats above the mountain ridge is a dinosaur. And somewhere in Cuba, in the forests and garden edges of an island in the Caribbean, the smallest living dinosaur is visiting flowers with a speed and precision that pushes the limits of what a vertebrate body can do. We will visit that creature in the next chapter. But for now, let the knowledge of the living dinosaurs settle into the background of your rest. Look out the window, if you can, or imagine looking out. Whatever birds are there, whatever sounds of wings or calls reach you in the dark, those are the sounds of animals that have been on Earth since before the asteroid fell, that have been diversifying and adapting for 66 million years, that carry in their hollow bones and their feathered skins the long evolutionary history of the theropod dynasty. They are the inheritors. They are the survivors. They are, in the truest and most precise scientific sense, the dinosaurs. There is an island in the Caribbean, the largest island in the Caribbean, where a creature lives that holds a record so extreme it is difficult to fully believe even after you have looked at the numbers. Cuba. The island is known for many things, for its music and its history, and the particular quality of its light in the late afternoon when the sun is going down over the Gulf of Mexico. And the colors of the buildings in Havana deepen into something almost unbearably beautiful. But it is also home to the smallest bird in the world. And because birds are dinosaurs, it is home to the smallest dinosaur in the world, a creature called the bee hummingbird, known in Spanish as the zunzuncito, a diminutive that perfectly captures the quality of something already small, being described in the most affectionate possible terms. The bee hummingbird, whose scientific name is Melassuga helenae, measures between 5 and 6 centimeters from the tip of its bill to the tip of its tail. It weighs between 1.6 and 2 grams. 2 grams. A single teaspoon of water weighs 5 grams, so a bee hummingbird weighs less than half a teaspoon of water. A US dime weighs 2.26 grams, so a bee hummingbird weighs less than a dime. A standard paperclip weighs approximately 1 gram, so a bee hummingbird weighs about as much as 2 paperclips. Every comparison makes it smaller. Every unit of measurement seems to recede from it, as if the creature exists at a scale that our everyday reference points are not calibrated to handle. It is not metaphorically tiny. It is literally the smallest feathered, warm-blooded, oxygen-breathing dinosaur that has ever lived in the recorded history of the world. To see a bee hummingbird is, by the accounts of the naturalists and ornithologists who have been fortunate enough to encounter them in the wild, an experience that requires a significant adjustment of what you expect from a living creature. Your eye looks for a bird-sized object and finds nothing. Then something moves, a blur, a shimmer, a tiny vortex of disturbed air around a flower, and you understand that the bird you are looking for is there, has been there, is already at the next flower, is 3 flowers away from where you are looking by the time your visual system has processed the information it gathered when the hummingbird was at the first flower. The speed of the bee hummingbird is extraordinary, not in the absolute sense. It does not move faster than a larger bird in miles per hour, but in the sense of quickness, of rapid direction changes and rapid accelerations and decelerations, of a creature that navigates the world at a tempo that is faster than most visual systems can easily track. The physiology of the bee hummingbird is as extreme as its size. Its heart rate during active flight exceeds 1,200 beats per minute. Consider that number for a moment. A human heart at rest beats perhaps 60 to 70 times a minute. During intense exercise, it might reach 200. The bee hummingbird's heart, at rest, beats perhaps 250 times a minute, and during flight it reaches 1,200 or more. The heart of this creature is not just fast. It is operating at a rate that is physiologically at or near the absolute limit for a warm-blooded vertebrate heart, a rate beyond which the individual muscle cells of the heart cannot relax and contract fast enough to pump blood effectively. The bee hummingbird is, in cardiac terms, living at the edge. Its wing beats match the cardiac intensity. A bee hummingbird beats its wings approximately 80 times per second during hovering flight. 80 times per second. The human eye cannot distinguish individual wing beats at that frequency. What we see is a blur, a shimmer, a haze of motion that our brains interpret as something approximately wing-shaped, but that is in reality something far more dynamic. 4 distinct wing positions cycling through 80 complete iterations every second, generating the lift and thrust that hold a 2-gram animal stationary in the air while its long bill probes the interior of a flower. The engineering required for this is extraordinary, and it represents 66 million years of avian evolution building on the 200 million year legacy of theropod design. The bee hummingbird eats nectar, primarily, visiting up to 1,500 flowers per day in order to maintain the caloric intake that its extreme metabolic rate demands. It also eats small insects and spiders for protein. Like all hummingbirds, it enters a state called torpor on cold nights, dropping its body temperature dramatically from its active temperature of approximately 40 degrees Celsius to something much closer to ambient temperature, and slowing its heart and breathing to a tiny fraction of their active rates. Torpor is not sleep, exactly. It is something closer to a controlled physiological shutdown, a way of surviving the night without expending the energy that maintaining full body temperature through the dark hours would require. In the morning, the bee hummingbird essentially reboots, raising its body temperature and restarting its metabolic processes over the course of several minutes, emerging from torpor into the full intensity of its diurnal life. The habitat of the bee hummingbird in Cuba is varied, including forest edges, gardens, and areas with abundant flowering plants. The female, slightly larger than the male, constructs a nest that is proportional to her body, roughly the size of a large coin, made from plant fibers and spider silk, and camouflaged with lichen. The eggs are pea-sized. The chicks, when they hatch, are essentially helpless and smaller than most insects. The investment in reproduction that the bee hummingbird makes is concentrated in these extraordinary miniature young who must grow rapidly to reach the body size and wing capability that will allow them to sustain themselves in the metabolic marathon of hummingbird life. The male bee hummingbird is spectacular in breeding plumage. With a rosy red to pink head and throat that catches the light in the same iridescent way that Microraptor's feathers, reconstructed from melanosome analysis, must have caught the light 125 million years ago. The continuity is real, and it is not metaphorical. The same biological mechanisms that produced iridescent feathers in Microraptor are operating refined by millions of additional generations of evolution in the bee hummingbird. The melanosomes that scatter light in the particular way that produces iridescence were present in the Cretaceous forests of China, and they are present in the gardens of Cuba, unchanged in their essential function across a gulf of time so vast that most human conceptions of deep time dissolve before they can encompass it. What does it mean, in the deepest sense, that the smallest living dinosaur weighs 2 grams and visits flowers at 1200 heartbeats per minute. It means that the story of dinosaur evolution, the story that began with relatively modest creatures in the Triassic and moved through the giants of the Jurassic and the diverse ecology of the Cretaceous, did not end with the asteroid 66 million years ago. It continued. It is continuing. The bee hummingbird is not a relic, not a survivor clinging to existence in the margins of the modern world. It is a thriving participant in the ecosystems of Cuba, an animal perfectly adapted to its environment, performing its ecological role as a pollinator of flowering plants, with an efficiency and precision that no other animal in its range can match. The relationship between hummingbirds and the flowers they visit is one of the most studied and most celebrated examples of coevolution in all of biology. Hummingbirds and certain flowers have evolved together, each shaping the other's development over millions of years. The flowers developing shapes and nectar concentrations that attract hummingbirds specifically, the hummingbirds developing bill shapes and tongue structures that allow them to access the nectar of specific flowers more efficiently. The bee hummingbird participates in this coevolutionary dance, and in doing so, it is playing a role in the reproductive success of the plants it visits, transferring pollen from flower to flower and enabling seed production that sustains the forest ecosystems it depends on. The smallest dinosaur is not a passive presence in its environment. It is an active ecological agent whose activities shape the communities around it. The evolutionary lineage that connects Microraptor, gliding on 4 iridescent wings through the Cretaceous forest of Liaoning 125 million years ago, to the bee hummingbird, hovering over a Cuban flower at 1200 heartbeats per minute in the 21st century, is long and complex and full of gaps and uncertainties. We do not have the complete fossil record of the 66 million year journey from Cretaceous bird ancestor to modern hummingbird. We do not know exactly when the hummingbird body plan took its current form, or when the hovering flight capability that distinguishes hummingbirds from all other birds was first developed. The hummingbird fossil record is sparse, partly because hummingbirds are small and their bones are fragile, and the preservation problem we discussed in an earlier chapter applies with full force to them. But we know the outlines of the story, and the outlines are enough to establish the connection. The theropod miniaturization trend that began in the Jurassic produced, over tens of millions of years, progressively smaller and more aerodynamically capable animals. The end Cretaceous survivors of that trend were already small and flight-capable and metabolically intense. In the empty world that followed the extinction, they diversified rapidly into the full range of modern bird forms. Somewhere in that diversification, the hummingbird lineage took shape, following the miniaturization trend further than any other bird lineage, pushing the boundaries of what a warm-blooded vertebrate body can do, arriving at the bee hummingbird, as the current record holder at the small end of the dinosaur size spectrum. Sit with the image of the bee hummingbird for a moment as your breathing slows and the night deepens around you. It is early morning in Cuba. The light is coming through the trees at a low angle, warm and golden, and the flowers are opening, and something so small you might initially mistake it for a large insect is moving between the blossoms, its wings invisible at the speed they move, its heart beating faster than you can count, its large eyes taking in the world at a resolution and speed that your own visual system cannot match. It has been doing this, or something very like this, for 66 million years. Its ancestors were doing something like this in the forests of the Cretaceous, and before that, in the forests of the Jurassic, smaller versions of the same essential strategy. The high metabolism, high activity, small body approach to existence were being tried and refined and passed on. You are sharing the world with this creature. Right now, as you rest and the darkness holds you, the bee hummingbird is in torpor in a Cuban garden, its heart barely beating, its body temperature dropped to conserve the energy it will need for tomorrow's 1200 flowers and 1200 heartbeats per minute, and the 1,000 precise navigational decisions it will make before the sun has moved a handspan from the horizon. It is the smallest dinosaur in the world. It is a miracle of evolutionary engineering, and it is alive. For most of the history of paleontology, the colors of ancient animals were beyond recovery. We could know their shapes, their sizes, their anatomical structures in varying degrees of detail. We could infer their behaviors from their anatomy and from the traces they left in sediment. We could reconstruct the ecosystems they inhabited from the associated fossils and the chemistry of the rocks they were buried in. But their colors, the actual visual appearance of these creatures as they moved through their living worlds, remained completely inaccessible. A feather in stone was a shape, an outline, sometimes a texture, but it was not a color. And color matters enormously in the lives of animals that can see it, because color is the medium of social communication, of mate choice, of predator recognition, of species identification. Without knowing the colors of ancient animals, we were missing an entire dimension of their lives. Then, in 2008, a paper was published in the journal Nature that changed everything. Researchers working on a fossil feather from the Eocene deposits of Denmark had noticed structures inside the fossilized feather that looked, under electron microscopy, remarkably like the melanosomes of modern birds. Melanosomes are organelles, membrane-bound structures within cells that contain melanin pigments. In modern birds, the shape of melanosomes is directly related to the color they produce. Spherical melanosomes produce black and dark gray colors. Elongated, rod-shaped melanosomes produce reddish-brown colors. Thin, flat melanosomes produce iridescent colors through the interference of light waves. The relationship is consistent and well understood because it has been extensively studied in modern birds where both the melanosome structure and the color are directly observable. The 2008 paper demonstrated that melanosomes in fossilized feathers are preserved with enough structural fidelity that their shapes can be determined from scanning electron microscopy. And because the relationship between melanosome shape and feather color is known, the colors of those fossilized feathers can, in principle, be inferred. The technique is not perfect. Not all feather colors are produced by melanosomes. Some are produced by carotenoid pigments, which are not preserved in the same way, and some are structural colors produced by the physical nanostructure of the feather rather than by any pigment at all. But for the very important class of black, gray, reddish-brown, and iridescent colors, which are produced by melanosomes, the technique works, and it opened a door that paleontologists have been walking through eagerly ever since. The first application of the technique to non-avian dinosaur feathers was to Sinosauropteryx, a small non-avian theropod from the Liaoning deposits that was the first non-avian dinosaur found with clearly preserved feather-like structures. Sinosauropteryx had a coat of simple, hair-like protofeathers covering its body, and analysis of the melanosomes in these protofeathers revealed that the animal was probably reddish-brown along its back and sides, with a series of alternating dark and light bands along its tail. The banded tail was unexpected and specific, the kind of detail that no amount of anatomical reasoning could have produced, visible only through the chemical signature left in the melanosomes after 130 million years of fossilization. Anchiornis huxleyi, a small Paravian dinosaur from the late Jurassic of Liaoning that predates Archaeopteryx by several million years and is thus among the earliest members of the birdline theropods, has been reconstructed in remarkable color detail through melanosome analysis. The study of Anchiornis, published in 2010, produced one of the most complete color reconstructions of any ancient animal. The body was predominantly dark grey to black. The face had a rufous, reddish-brown crest on the top of the skull. The wings were black with white spots or patches near the tips of the feathers, creating a pattern somewhat reminiscent of a modern woodpecker. This striking patterning, black and white with a reddish crown, suggests that Anchiornis was a visually communicating animal, an animal for which the appearance of other individuals of its species was important information. It was not a drab, undifferentiated creature of the forest floor. It was a patterned, visually complex animal with a color scheme that suggests active social communication. Microraptor's iridescent black plumage, discovered in 2012 through the same melanosome technique, was even more striking. The iridescence of modern crows and ravens is produced by the particular geometry of their melanosomes, which are arranged in layers that cause light waves to interfere with each other in ways that produce the blue-green shimmer we see. The melanosomes of Microraptor were found to be arranged in similar layers, producing similar interference patterns, resulting in a similar iridescent effect. The crow-like iridescence of Microraptor is not a coincidence. It reflects the deep shared ancestry between Microraptor and modern corvids. The the same underlying biology that produces structural iridescence in both cases, the same melanosome geometry expressing the same optical physics. What does iridescence signal in the animals that have it? In modern birds, iridescent plumage is almost universally associated with mate attraction and social status signaling. The shimmer of a starling in sunlight, the blue-green gloss of a hummingbird's throat gorget, the purple iridescence of a gracle's head. These are social signals, advertisements of quality and health and genetic fitness, directed at potential mates and at rivals. If Microraptor had iridescent plumage for the same reasons, then Microraptor was engaging in a social life that involved visual assessment of other individuals, choice of mates based on appearance, competition for social status in which visual signals played a role. This is not the dinosaur of old popular imagination, the dumb reflex machine with a tiny brain and no inner life. This is something considerably more sophisticated, an animal for which the world of other individuals of its species was a complex social environment requiring interpretation and response. The range of colors that have been reconstructed in small feathered dinosaurs through melanosome analysis is now considerable. Dark blacks and glossy iridescences, warm reddish browns, striped and banded patterns. The evidence points to a world of small feathered dinosaurs that was visually complex and colorful in ways that we did not imagine before the melanosome technique became available. This makes ecological sense. Visually oriented animals in complex environments tend to evolve elaborate visual signals, because the ability to communicate information about identity, status, and reproductive quality through visual means is enormously valuable in dense forest environments, where visual contact between individuals may be brief and partial and needs to carry as much information as possible in as short a time as possible. The technique has continued to improve since its first applications in the late 2000s. Better scanning electron microscopy, better reference databases of melanosome shapes from modern birds of known color, and better computational methods for analyzing and interpreting melanosome data have all improved the accuracy and precision of color reconstructions. Specimens that were initially analyzed with cruder versions of the technique are being revisited with more refined methods, sometimes confirming the initial reconstructions and sometimes modifying them in important ways. The colors of the ancient feathered dinosaurs are becoming clearer, more specific, more detailed as the science develops. There is something philosophically remarkable about the melanosome technique that goes beyond its scientific applications. It represents the recovery of information that, by all normal expectations, should have been permanently lost. When a creature dies and its remains undergo fossilization, the biological information they contain is progressively destroyed. The soft tissues go first, then the chemical gradients within preserved tissues, then the organic molecules, and finally, over geological time, even the mineral replacements that preserve bone shapes can be altered or destroyed. The fact that melanosomes, those microscopic cellular organelles, survive 150 million years in the matrix of fossilized feathers with enough structural fidelity to reveal color is not something that anyone predicted before it was discovered. It was a surprise, a lucky gift from the chemistry of the Earth, an unexpected preservation of information that the scale of geological time seemed to make impossible. The melanosome revolution has broader implications for how we understand the lives of small feathered dinosaurs. If these animals had complex, patterned plumage, they were communicating visually. If they were communicating visually, they were living in social environments where such communication was advantageous. If they were living in social environments, they were engaging in behaviors, mate selection, territory defense, group coordination, perhaps even cooperative behaviors of the kind we see in modern corvids and parrots, that required a degree of cognitive sophistication considerably beyond the simple reactive behavior that was long attributed to dinosaurs. The colors in the stone are not just colors, they are windows into social worlds, into the behaviors and relationships and cognitive lives of creatures that have been gone for tens of millions of years. Anchiornis in particular has become something of an icon of this new understanding. The creature that was, before melanosome analysis, a generic small feathered paravian, indistinguishable in reconstructed appearance from a dozen other species, is now a specific animal with a specific appearance, a black and white patterned body, with a reddish crown, moving through the late Jurassic forests of what is now China. with a visual presence as distinctive as a modern woodpecker. We can imagine, now, what another Anchiornis would have seen when it encountered a conspecific. A creature with a color scheme that immediately communicated species identity, individual quality, and social status, all in a glance. The world of the small feathered dinosaurs was not grey and uniform. It was, in some respects, as visually complex and information-rich as the world of modern forest birds. As you drift and the colours of the day fade from your thoughts, let the colours of the ancient forest take their place for a moment. Reddish-brown along the back, banded rings on the tail, the warm reddish crown of an Anchiornis catching the filtered light of a Jurassic morning. The blue-green shimmer of Microraptor's wings as it adjusts its position in the canopy, the light hitting its feathers at an angle that makes them flash. The ribbon-tail feathers of Epidexipteryx, perhaps coloured in ways we have not yet recovered from their melanosomes, perhaps plain and dark, perhaps banded and bright, trailing through the dim understory like a flag whose message we have not yet fully learned to read. The ancient forest was not the monochrome world of old museum dioramas. It was alive with colour, alive with signal, alive with the constant exchange of visual information between creatures that were, in their own ways and by the standards of their own time, as sophisticated and as complex as any living thing that shares the world with us today. The history of paleontology is, in part, a history of looking at things that were already there and not seeing them, not through carelessness, not through negligence, but through the simple human limitation of not having the conceptual framework to recognize what you are looking at when you look at it. A fossil in a drawer is a fossil. It is labeled, catalogued, given a number and a location and a date of collection and a preliminary identification. And then it waits, sometimes for decades, sometimes for longer, until someone comes along with the right question and the right tools and the right moment of attention and sees what was there all along. The story of Sinosauropteryx illustrates this beautifully. The first specimens of this animal were found by a farmer in Liaoning province in 1996. The farmer brought the specimens to Ji Chang, a Chinese paleontologist, who immediately recognized them as extraordinary. The slabs showed not just the skeleton but a clear fringe of fine filamentous structures around the bones. The protofeathers, whose significance was immediately apparent to anyone familiar with the debate about the relationship between birds and dinosaurs. Sinosauropteryx was formally described in 1996 and caused a sensation in the paleontological world. But what is less well known is that similar filamentous structures had been observed on theropod specimens before and not recognized for what they were. The structures were there. The eyes to see them for what they were had to arrive separately. This pattern of retrospective recognition runs through the history of small dinosaur paleontology with remarkable consistency. Anchiornis, now one of the best-studied small Paravian dinosaurs in the world, was initially described as a troodontid dinosaur, and then, in a revised paper published shortly after, reclassified as a more basal Paravian, closer to the base of the bird lineage. The original description was not wrong in its documentation of the specimen. It was incomplete in its interpretation, constrained by the framework of knowledge available at the time it was written and revised as that framework expanded. Epidexipteryx was initially difficult to place in the theropod family tree because its strange combination of features did not neatly match any previously described group. Yi Qi sat in a private collection for some time before it was formally described, because the membrane wing structures were so unexpected that they needed careful documentation and multiple specialist reviews before they could be confidently reported. The problem of the museum drawer is real and ongoing. Natural history museums around the world collectively hold tens of millions of paleontological specimens, and the resources to study all of them in detail simply do not exist. Major institutions with world-class collections are perpetually understaffed relative to the volume of material they hold, and the rate of new collection generally exceeds the rate of formal description and publication. This means that at any given moment, there are almost certainly important specimens sitting undescribed in the collections of every major natural history museum, specimens that would, if examined carefully with current knowledge and current techniques, tell us something new about the small dinosaurs of the Mesozoic. The American Museum of Natural History, the Natural History Museum in London, the Paleontological Institute in Beijing, the Senckenberg Museum in Frankfurt, the Field Museum in Chicago, All of these institutions have collections of Mesozoic material that include undescribed small vertebrate specimens. Some of these specimens have been examined cursorily and set aside. Others have been examined in detail but not yet published. Others have been examined by researchers who were looking for something else and did not fully attend to the material in front of them. The potential for discovery in existing collections is enormous, and it is being increasingly recognized and acted upon as CT scanning and other non-destructive analytical techniques make it practical to examine fragile specimens in ways that were previously impossible. The Alvarezsauridae represent one of the most instructive cases of looking at something without fully understanding what you are seeing. These small theropods, known from sites in Mongolia, China, South America, and North America, have a highly derived and apparently specialized forelimb anatomy with greatly reduced arms that end in a single enlarged claw. For a long time after their discovery, the function of this peculiar forelimb was unclear. They were too reduced for effective grasping. They were too small relative to the body for effective digging. Then, a series of studies examining the muscle attachments and the bone proportions in detail came to a conclusion that makes sense in retrospect, but that required a specific kind of attention to arrive at. The single large claw of the Alvarezsaurids is structurally very similar to the digging claws of modern animals that break into insect colonies, specifically into the hard nests of termites and similar social insects. The Alvarezsaurids were, in all probability, specialized insect nest raiders, using their powerful single claw to breach the hard walls of termite mounds and then using their small, specialized snout to extract the insects within. This interpretation, once proposed, transformed the Alvarezsaurids from anatomical puzzles into ecological specialists, with a very specific and well-defined role in the Cretaceous ecosystems they inhabited. It also drew a connection between Alvarezsaurid ecology and the ecology of modern anteaters, aardvarks, and armadillos, none of which are related to Alvarezsaurids, but all of which have evolved convergently towards similar ecological roles in modern ecosystems. The similarity is not coincidental. Insect nests are a rich and relatively secure food resource, accessible to specialized diggers but not to generalist predators, and the ecological opportunity they represent has been independently exploited by multiple lineages across the history of vertebrate life. The ghost lineages of small dinosaurs haunt the edges of every family tree that paleontologists construct. When you draw a phylogenetic tree of the Paravian theropods, the group that includes birds and their closest non-avian relatives, you are drawing a tree that includes only the taxa for which you have fossil evidence. But the tree itself implies that there were other branches, other lineages, that diverged and evolved and went extinct without leaving any record that has been found. Between every pair of taxa in the tree, there are implied intermediate forms. Between the node that represents the origin of birds and the earliest known bird fossils, there are implied ancestors that we have not found. These are not fictional creatures. They are as real as any other extinct animal. They simply have not left recoverable traces. Or if they did, those traces have not yet been found. The concept of ghost lineages is particularly important for the very small dinosaurs because the preservation bias problem is most severe at small body sizes. The smaller the animal, the larger the ghost lineage. Because the smaller the animal, the more likely its remains are to have been destroyed before they could become fossils. For the very smallest non-avian dinosaurs that ever existed, the ones at the extreme small end of the size spectrum, the ones that would win the smallest dinosaur competition, if we could run it completely, the ghost lineage problem is most acute. We know they existed because the family tree requires them. We know they were small because the overall miniaturization trend requires them. And we know we have not found them because the fossil record at those small sizes is so sparse that a single specimen can represent an entire species. What would it mean to find the genuinely smallest non-avian dinosaur? Not Microraptor, which at roughly half a kilogram is small but not extreme. Not Epidexipteryx or Parvicursor or the other small species we have discussed, but something genuinely at the lower boundary of non-avian dinosaur body size, something in the territory of 50 grams or less, something that would qualify as truly tiny even within the context of small feathered theropods. We do not know if such an animal has been found and not recognized, or if it exists in the fossil record but in deposits that have not yet been properly excavated, or if it exists only as a ghost lineage implied by the family tree but never preserved. The current record holder for smallest confirmed non-avian dinosaur is a matter of some active debate among specialists, with Parvicursor remotus from Mongolia and several other small alvarezsaurids and Paravian theropods competing for the title based on body mass estimates that all carry considerable uncertainty. Parvicursor remotus deserves its moment here, because it is not as famous as Microraptor or Epidexipteryx, but represents one of the most important data points in the story of dinosaur miniaturization. Known from a partial skeleton found in the Mongolian Gobi Desert, Parvicursor was a member of the Alvarezsauridae and was estimated to have been approximately 39 centimeters long, roughly the size of a thrush or a starling, with a body mass of perhaps 160 grams. This is smaller than Epidexipteryx, and considerably smaller than Microraptor, and it lived in a different ecological context, in the open, somewhat arid environments of late Cretaceous Mongolia rather than the forested environments of Liaoning. The Mongolian small theropod fauna is less well known than the Liaoning fauna, partly because the preservation conditions in the Gobi are different and less conducive to the exceptional preservation of feathers and other soft tissues that has made Liaoning so productive. The question of what science almost missed, taken broadly, is really a question about the limits of attention. Science is performed by human beings with finite time and finite cognitive resources working within institutional structures that have their own priorities and constraints. The small, the fragmentary, the ambiguous, the specimens that do not fit neatly into existing categories, these are the ones most likely to be set aside, to wait in drawers, to be underappreciated until someone with the right question and the right tools comes along to recognize their significance. The history of the smallest dinosaurs is disproportionately a history of things almost missed, of fossils almost overlooked, of significance almost unrecognized. And the future of the smallest dinosaurs is almost certainly a history of things not yet seen, of fossils not yet found, of significance not yet appreciated. There is a quality of patience required by this kind of science that is worth honoring. The patience of the researcher who examines one small fragment of Cretaceous bone after another, day after day, looking for something that may or may not be in the sample but that will not reveal itself to impatience or inattention. The patience of the museum collection that holds its specimens in climate-controlled cabinets and acid-free boxes, year after year and decade after decade, waiting for the technology or the conceptual framework that will finally reveal their significance. The patience of the stone itself, which has held its secrets for tens of millions of years without any urgency about when they will be found, content to preserve what they hold until the moment is right and the right eyes appear to see them. What science almost missed is, in the end, still partly missed, and partly still to be found, and partly beyond finding, and that is the honest state of knowledge at any moment in the history of a field. The small dinosaurs are not fully known. They may never be fully known, but they are far better known than they were 50 years ago, and the trajectory of that improvement shows no sign of flattening. The next great discovery may be in a drawer somewhere. It may be in a formation somewhere waiting for the first shovel. It may be in an amber deposit in Myanmar, in material not yet extracted from the earth. We do not know where it is. We know only that it exists, and that the patience and the attention to bring it into knowledge will eventually arrive. We have come a long way tonight, from the ancient forests of the Jurassic to the amber deposits of Myanmar, from the shallow lakes of early Cretaceous Liaoning to the gardens of modern Cuba, from the ghost lineages that exist only as mathematical necessities in the structure of family trees, to the bee hummingbird that exists in full metabolic reality in the Caribbean right now. We have traced a line through time that is so long it barely registers as a line at all and more resembles an ocean, a deep and fathomless body of time, in which individual events are like waves that rise and fall and leave traces in the sediment but do not persist as themselves. The line is the story of smallness in the dinosaur lineage, the story of diminishing, the story of something getting smaller and smaller over 50 million years until it reached a size that no one would have predicted from the starting point. Let us trace that line one more time, gently, as the night deepens and the distance between you and the waking world grows comfortable. 230 million years ago, in the late Triassic, the first dinosaurs are small and marginal, perhaps a meter long, living in the shadows of more dominant reptiles. They are not yet the story. They are the setup for the story. Over the next 50 million years, some of them become enormous, become the story, become the giants that define the Mesozoic in every popular imagination. But within that dynasty of giants, a quiet sublineage is doing something different. The Microraptorans are getting smaller, generation by generation, a process so slow that no individual within it could perceive it. They are diminishing. 160 million years ago, in the late Jurassic, the Scansauropterygids are in the trees of what is now China, pressing their grasping feet against bark in the dim light of ancient mornings. They are small, sparrow-sized or a little larger, and they are already representing the endpoint of a miniaturization process that has been running for tens of millions of years. In those same forests, Anchiornis is moving through the understory, with its black and white patterned wings and its reddish crown, visually communicating with others of its kind in ways we can now partially reconstruct from the melanosomes frozen in its fossil feathers. In the trees above it, perhaps, something like Yi Chi is spreading its strange membrane wings between branches, gliding on its bat-like surfaces through the dappled forest light, a creature with no descendants that we know of, but with a story that tells us the aerial experimentation of the Jurassic was broader and more varied than anything we had imagined. 125 million years ago, in the early Cretaceous, Microraptor is in the conifers of Liaoning, its 4 iridescent black wings folded against its body as it watches the forest floor below. It is perhaps the most aerodynamically sophisticated animal that has ever lived, by some measures, carrying 4 sets of flight-capable feathers and using them in configurations that no modern animal duplicates, gliding through the forest in a particular way that its body has been refined over millions of years to perform. It is eating fish and lizards and small birds, and when the sun catches its feathers at the right angle, it flashes with the same blue-green iridescence as a crow, the same underlying melanosome architecture, producing the same optical effect across a gap of more than 100 million years. 99 million years ago, the amber of Myanmar is forming, trapping in its golden medium the feathers and insects and small vertebrates of a Cretaceous forest that is now stone and hill and the subject of mining operations whose human context is complex and whose scientific yield is extraordinary. In that amber, preserved in 3 dimensions with a fidelity that sedimentary rock can never match, are feathers from creatures we have not yet formally described, whose owners we can only infer from the structures of their plumage. They are waiting. They have been waiting for 99 million years. They will continue to wait as long as they need to, until the right eyes find them. 66 million years ago, the asteroid arrives. The Chicxulub impactor, perhaps 12 kilometers in diameter, strikes what is now the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico and releases energy equivalent to several billion nuclear weapons simultaneously. In the weeks and months that follow, the sky fills with debris and the sun is blocked and the temperatures drop and the food chains that sustain the large animals of the Cretaceous collapse. The non-avian dinosaurs, even the smallest of them, mostly go extinct. But some small, feathered, already very bird-like theropods survive. They huddle in whatever shelter exists and eat whatever is available and wait for the sky to clear. And the sky eventually clears, and they emerge into a world of rubble and regrowth and extraordinary ecological opportunity. They are the ancestors of every bird alive today. They are the inheritors. 66 million years of bird evolution have passed since that moment of inheritance. 66 million years of diversification into the 10,000 plus species of modern birds. 66 million years of continued miniaturization in some lineages, continued diversification in body size and form across the group as a whole. And at the end of all of that, in the forests and gardens of Cuba, a creature the size and weight of a large bumblebee is hovering over a flower, its wings invisible with speed, its heart beating 1,200 times a minute, its large eyes scanning the flower for the orientation that will allow its long, specialized bill to reach the nectar within. It weighs 2 grams. It is the smallest dinosaur in the world. It is the current endpoint of a journey that began 230 million years ago. The long diminishing that we have traced tonight is not merely a story about size. It is a story about adaptation, about the way that evolutionary pressures acting consistently over enormous spans of time can produce changes so dramatic that the endpoint bears almost no resemblance to the starting point. The tyrannosaur and the bee hummingbird are both dinosaurs. They share an ancestor. Between them, in time and form, lies the entire story of the theropod lineage. And that story is one of the most extraordinary in the 4 billion-year history of life on Earth. Not because the theropods were the most successful group in terms of raw numbers, though the modern birds are extraordinarily diverse and abundant. Not because they were the largest, though the giant sauropods and the large theropods were among the largest land animals ever. But because their history contains such a sweep, such a range of scales and forms, such a multiplicity of experiments and innovations and extinctions and survivals, there is a lesson in the story of the smallest dinosaurs that is not exclusively about dinosaurs. It is about the relationship between smallness and resilience, about the way that being small and flexible and metabolically intense can be an advantage when the world changes faster than large-bodied animals can adapt. The small animals of the Mesozoic, the ones that paleontologists for a long time overlooked in favor of the spectacular giants, turned out to be the ones carrying the evolutionary future. They were the marginal ones, the ones in the shadows, the ones that did not dominate any ecosystem in the way that the large titanosaurs dominated the open lowlands or the large tyrannosaurs dominated their hunting grounds. And they outlasted everything. They outlasted the giants. They outlasted the ecosystems. They outlasted the asteroid. And they are still here. The question that arises, quietly and without urgency in the long dark of a night like this one, is what we should take from that. We live in a world that is changing rapidly. More rapidly than any natural process other than a mass extinction event has ever changed it. The rules of survival are shifting. The comfortable, stable world that large, slow-adapting creatures depend on is becoming less stable and less predictable. The small, the flexible, the metabolically intense, the behaviorally innovative. These are the qualities that the history of life repeatedly rewards when the rules change. Not that this offers a simple prescription for human behavior. Human beings are not small, and we cannot make ourselves small. But there is something in the story of the tiny dinosaurs, in their sustained and patient 50-million-year project of diminishment and refinement, that speaks to the value of adaptability, of being prepared to occupy marginal spaces when the central ones become inhospitable, of carrying within yourself the capacity for transformation even when transformation seems unnecessary. The smallest dinosaur that ever lived is a question that does not have a single clean answer, and that lack of a clean answer is itself instructive. It is almost certainly not a species we have found yet. The fossil record of small dinosaurs is too incomplete, the preservation bias too severe, for us to be confident that our current smallest known species is genuinely the smallest that ever existed. There are ghost lineages down there at the smallest end of the size spectrum, families of creatures that left no recoverable trace, that lived and hunted and communicated visually and raised their young in nests and died and were scattered and dissolved in the sediment without leaving anything we can find. They were real. They were probably extraordinary. And they are gone in a way that is different from the way the bee hummingbird is gone each evening into torpor, gone in a way that no morning will undo. But science almost missed the ones we did find, and that is the title of the last chapter before this one for a reason. Almost missed. Not completely missed. Microraptor is found. Epidexipteryx is found. Anchiornis is found. Yichi is found. The melanosome technique has recovered colors from stone that no one expected to ever see. The CT scanners have revealed structures in tiny fossils that preparation by hand would have destroyed. The screen washing techniques have recovered teeth and fragments from sediment that surface prospecting would have ignored. We are, as a species, getting better at finding the small things, at recognizing their significance, at building the conceptual frameworks that let us understand what we are looking at when we find a 7mm skull in amber, or a hollow bird-like bone in a Jurassic rock formation, or a single tooth in the residue of a screen-washing operation in the Gobi Desert. The night is full and quiet around you now. The day has receded completely, has become a memory that is already softening at the edges and will be softer still by morning. What remains is the dark and the sound of your own breathing and, if you listen, the distant sound of the world, the particular quality of silence, that is not silence at all, but a texture composed of small sounds, too numerous to distinguish individually. Somewhere in that texture tonight, there are birds. There are always birds, even in cities, even in the winter, even in the dark. They are roosting in the eaves and the trees, their hearts beating slowly in the rest of torpor or sleep, their feathered bodies warm against the cold air around them. They are the smallest dinosaurs alive. And the story of how they came to be here, in the eaves and the trees and the edge of your awareness on a night like this one, is the story we have been telling all night. A story of diminishment, of patience, of survival against all reasonable expectation, of something very small carrying the whole future of a dynasty forward through 66 million years of change. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to see more videos like this, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel, as it really helps us continue making more content. Anyways, see you in the next one. Let the story go now. Let it dissolve the way old amber dissolves in a dream, slowly and without urgency, the creatures inside it becoming suggestions rather than creatures, the forest around them becoming a feeling rather than a place. You have traveled tonight through 230 million years, and the journey has been a long one, and it is time to rest. Think of something very small, if you can still hold a thought at all. Something no bigger than the palm of your hand, something warm and feathered and still in the way that sleeping things are still. The stillness that is not the absence of life but the gathering of it, the drawing in that happens when an organism reduces its metabolism to the minimum that survival requires and waits, patient and warm, for the return of morning. This is what the bee hummingbird does each night. This is what the small feathered creatures of the Cretaceous forests did each night, pressed against the bark of ancient trees, or tucked into hollows in the roots, or gathered in small groups in the most sheltered corners of a forest that no longer exists anywhere except in the rock. You are doing something like that now, gathering in, reducing, releasing the activity of the day, and letting what remains be only the slow and essential, the breathing and the heartbeat and the quiet processing of a mind beginning to dream. This is not a lesser state. It is the state that allows the morning. It is the state that every small, warm-blooded creature has practiced for 300 million years. The art of surviving the night, by giving the night what it needs, which is stillness and quiet, and the absence of the day's urgency. The ancient forests are gone, the Jurassic conifers, and the Cretaceous lake beds, and the amber-producing trees of Myanmar are all gone, replaced by the world we know, which is itself constantly becoming another world. But the small, warm-blooded, feathered creatures that moved through those forests are not gone. They are in the eaves and the trees and the gardens and the fields and the forests of the world as it is now, living at the speed that their ancestors established, visiting the flowers that their coevolution has shaped, carrying in their hollow bones and their iridescent feathers and their 1,200 heartbeats per minute, the unbroken thread of a lineage that has been alive, in one form or another, for more than 200 million years. Let your breathing slow to its own rhythm now, the rhythm that belongs to sleep rather than to waking, the slower and deeper rhythm of a body preparing for its own nightly diminishment. The smallest dinosaurs are at rest, the largest mountains are at rest in the only way mountains rest, which is the way stone is still, which is not stillness exactly but the slowness of geological time, which from the inside looks like stillness and from the outside looks like eternity. Everything is slowing down, the world is going quiet. And you are part of that quieting, as much as the hummingbird in its torpor is part of it, as much as the ancient stone that holds the feather impressions of creatures gone 100 million years is part of it. Rest now. The morning will bring back everything the night takes, and what the night gives you, in the still and undemanding dark, is worth having. If you liked this video, let me know where in the world you are watching from and what time it is. I am always curious about that. And if you have a suggested topic you would like to hear about, feel free to leave it in the comments below.